Chapter 326. Su Lu had never planned to use actual combat to establish his authority as an instructor, because he did not have the simulation system with him right now. Before heading to S2 to assassinate Macklin, he had taken out the simulation system from under the workbench and placed it in the safe at Whitewater Company. Now, that expensive workbench had become the evidence of the Federation government, and he did not know whether he still had the authority to enter Whitewater Company, so he could only leave the simulation system there. The call was to Li Xiaodong. After being released from prison, Su Lu had not gone to see him, even though he was the first person in the Federation willing to invest in him. Su Lu knew from Zhou Yu that the Li family was not in a good situation right now. Because the government and the parliament had continuously passed the gold fusion algorithm, the Li family's influence in the financial industry of the Federation had taken a heavy blow. These measures would not shake the foundation of the Iron family, but as the second in line to the family, Li Xiaodong must be busy right now. From a certain perspective, Su Lu should be the Li family's irreconcilable enemy, but he had always maintained some kind of tacit relationship with 7th young Master Li. Now that Su Lu had gained the favor of the Lis of Philadelphia, just this point alone could convince Li Xiaodong to invest a second time and maintain this almost friendly relationship, and the upper echelons of the Li family could only acquiesce. Su Lu needed 7th young Master Li's help to reassemble the simulation system. In fact, even without the help of the simulation system, he believed that he could still defeat this batch of officer students in the base by operating the MX mecha. However, Zhou Yu had seen the Battle of Kachim Peak with his own eyes. If the difference in skill level was too great, it might arouse his suspicion. After all, this gentle gentleman had too close a relationship with Macho at the back of the mountain, so Su Lu had to be careful. More importantly, if he could not display Madman Li's level of battle prowess in battle and obtain an overwhelming victory, then even if he won this battle, what was the point? She had signed a contract to sell her body and was transferred by the Department of Defense to serve a group of military officers. This was not happiness at all. However, everyone had a different view of happiness. Su Lu rubbed his cheeks and looked at himself in the mirror with a smile. He began to carefully shave his beard. He thought of the difficult days in the black prison and how he no longer had to worry about his identity as a fugitive. Every time he washed his face, he no longer had to trim his eyebrows. He felt endless happiness. The training base in the mountains went from early summer to late summer, and then the autumn wind gradually rose, but it couldn't blow away the summer heat. The days passed by in such a boring manner. Although the officers from the various units were still angry, they were exceptionally serious in their learning and training. In the underground mecha storeroom, the 3 MX standard mecha were actually trained night after night, lined up by the officers to train them. Although they were not frail bodies, it was still extremely tiring. Su Lu really hadn't expected that his simple provocation of disdain would actually have some effect. These officers were clearly all academically trained soldiers who had graduated from military academies. Their IQ and EQ couldn't be low, so how was it that things were going according to his plan? After thinking about it, he could only attribute this to the atmosphere of the military camp. Although there was also deception and deception in the military, it was still a distance away from society after all. It retained a rare sense of simplicity and simplicity. These officers had been in the military for a long time, so the simple and direct part of their bodies had manifested. Perhaps some of them roughly understood Instructor Su's intentions, but no one would give him a good attitude. They just kept their heads down and trained, waiting for the beautiful day to come when they passed the assessment and beat the instructor up. Simple and direct was very much in line with Su Li's personality, so these days, he kept his usual sullen face, playing the role of a cold and disdainful instructor. He wasn't worried about the arrival of that day. Instead, through the new sunglasses that Zhou Yu had sent him, he looked with interest at these officers who were howling as if they had taken aphrodisiac and had nowhere to vent their energy. He thought to himself, so the military is actually such a simple place. There was no ready-made tutorial for the MX training, so Su Lu had to compile everything on the spot. Moreover, the MX in the nutshell production department and the assembly line of the main assembly base had undergone many minor adjustments compared to the prototype designed by Su Lu and Shang Qiu. He also didn't have any teaching experience, so every day, teaching classes was actually a very painful process. Fortunately, he had obtained a lot of information from the Nutshell Production Company through the Ministry of Defense, and had also applied for permission to work remotely with Shang Qiu. In addition, he had the experience of training in Area H1 of Yue University's library, so he was able to do this job with great difficulty. Sometimes, Su Lu would feel a little smug. The federal military probably really needed this teaching material. If he could do this job well, wouldn't Mr. Shi's special pardon order be issued? Other than tormenting himself with the MX mecha training, Su Lu was also silently paying attention to the situation in the West Woods and the movements within the Federation. The Federation's proverb had once said, "Even after leaving the palace of His Majesty and being amongst the stars, one still could not forget the troubles of the world." Su Lu knew what kind of intelligence this imperial spy had sent back, but he didn't know when the next war would break out. The Federation government was anxiously waiting, and so was he. But first came the good news that the leader of the Green Dragon Mountain anti-government army, Nanshui, was visiting the capital. In these peaceful days, the first gust of autumn wind at the beginning of September brought another batch of students to the training base. Su Lu, who had been ordered by the base's commanding officer to receive them, saw the dozen or so men jumping out of military vehicles at the entrance of the base. His eyes narrowed involuntarily. Autumn had not yet arrived, but he could already feel the chill. There were a total of 17 men, some of them tall and sturdy, some of them lean and strong, some of them cold and ruthless. They were not wearing military uniforms, but they exuded a murderous aura from head to toe. However, some of them could hide this murderous aura with just a slight turn of their bodies, leaving not a trace of it exposed. Xiong Linquan, Lu Jiao, Gu Shifeng and Major Lan Xiaolong. Su Lu looked at the row of people standing at attention in front of him, and understood why the base's commanding officer had sent him, a temporary instructor, to receive them. It was because of these 17 men, other than Lan Xiaolong, the rest were all members of the 7th Combat Team of the Whitewater Company. The 7th Combat Team of the Security Advisory Department of the Whitewater Company under the jurisdiction of the Nutshell Company has been reorganized. We have been ordered to report to the commanding officer. Please give us further instructions. The fierce combatants stood side by side meticulously. Gunner Xiong Linquan took a step forward and shouted at Su Lu, his voice shaking the mountains. Su Lu was speechless. He did not know if this person was shouting at him because he had stabbed Bai Yulan, or if it was because of his habitual loud voice. Fortunately, he had been a cold and ruthless instructor at the training base for more than 2 months. He had more or less cultivated the cold and fierce aura of a soldier, so he could calmly look at the big face in front of him and did not take a step back. After a moment of silence, he did not understand and said softly, "There are no instructions. Since you're here, let's eat first." Sitting behind the self-propelled green rail car that entered the base, Su Lu took off his sunglasses, narrowed his eyes and asked with a frown, "What's going on?" The 7th Combat Team was reorganized. Why was it sent to the base? It was a direct order from the Ministry of National Defense. The 7th Combat Team has been reorganized for a long time, but you, the director, have not been here, so they have been idle. The 83-84 Combat Team also picked a group of people to be the peripheral force of the 7th Combat Team. This time, they did not come with you. Now that I think about it, the people you can command are basically a battalion. Major Lan Xiaolong sat beside him. As an officer of the Harbor City Guard District, he had spent some time with Su Lu, so he was comfortable talking to him. He shrugged and said, "In Harbor City, the order I received was to protect you, and now it seems to be the same." Sulu was silent for a long time. Looking at the silent members in front of the rail car, he pursed his lips and said, "I'm asking why. It was an order from the Ministry of National Defense. How do we know the reason?" Lan Xiaolong shrugged again and said, "But I can guess a little." Sulu looked at him with a bitter smile and said, "Hurry up and say it, or the question marks in my head are going to explode." "I'm from the 17th Armored Division. White Magnolia." Lan Xiaolong looked at his face and said, "You're also from the 17th Division. Out of the 18 members of the 7th Combat Team, 15 of them are from our division. The 7th Combat Team has always been the strongest in the Whitewater Company. The Ministry of National Defense bypassed the Nutshell Board of Directors and directly ordered the reorganization of the 7th Combat Team. The 83-84 Combat Team was stationed in the Harbor City Guard District. Before the unit's designation was changed, it was the most famous 17th Armored Division of the Federation. Li Pifu was the commander of the 17th Armored Division. Sulu was silent. How could a combat team of the security company be related to the old man in Philadelphia? "You're training officers in the training base, which is contributing to the Federal Army. You're leading the 7th Combat Team to give you a group of your own subordinate." Lan Xiaolong took a puff of his cigarette, and his expression became serious and serious. The old commander definitely doesn't want to see his old unit turn from an iron-blooded army into a group of riff-raff troops. Since he thinks highly of you, this mission naturally has to be given to you. You definitely can't be a commander now, so you can only start practicing with the 7th Combat Team. Sulu felt that this reasoning was too ridiculous. Li Pifu was the Federation's god of war. Even if he took care of him a little for the sake of his uncle, how could he let him do this kind of thing? "You guessed right." "Nonsense, if I could know what those big shots are thinking, why would I be a soldier? Wouldn't it be better to just charge into the stock market?" Lan Xiaolong said in annoyance. The team members in front of the railcar had been sitting for a while, but now they began to relax. Some of them crossed their legs, some of them began to smoke, and some of them began to talk loudly. Sulu shook his head and thought about how this major peeked at Shang Qiu's cleavage in the underground base of the Ministry of Engineering. He sighed and said, "No wonder you're from the 83-84 Combat Team. Same here, you're not a proper soldier either." Lan Xiaolong shrugged and said, "In addition to the 30 or so excellent military officers in the training base, there were suddenly 17 more unofficially organized armed personnel. Although according to the Ministry of Defense, these armed personnel were only there to listen, the atmosphere in the base still became a little strange. The 3 major security companies of the Federation often cooperated with the military in battle, but there was a gap between active duty soldiers and these unofficially organized soldiers. The armed personnel of Team 7 actually had military records in their respective units, but for some reason, when they returned to the unit, they didn't look like professional soldiers at all. They were doing their duty as unofficially organized soldiers. The most important thing was that the officers who received the training had graduated from various universities and belonged to the typical academic faction. However, the 17 men who came later were definitely born in the wilderness. They all started off as small soldiers on the battlefield and relied on killing enemies to get to where they were today. In terms of rank, the trained officers were naturally higher. Other than Lan Xiaolong, none of the members of Team 7 had the nerve to take out their epaulets to dry. In terms of commanding ability and comprehensive assessment of some subjects, the trained officers were also a lot better than the members of Team 7. But when it came to specific combat ability, those 17 men were all looking up, full of disdain and contempt for these academic military nobles. What made Sulu feel strange was that although the atmosphere in the base was strange and tense, there was no intense conflict between the two sides. After 2 days of observation, even though his but was vaguely on Team 7's side, He had to admit that it was mainly because those academic soldiers were maintaining their tolerance and did not show the attitude of a superior officer. The attention of the trained officers was all on the upcoming mecha assessment. Most of the other subjects had already been completed, but for this MX mecha assessment, their eyes were already red from waiting. Because of the attitude Su Lu had displayed in the base, the trained officers began to dig up his background. In the end, they finally found out about his relationship with the Minister of Defense's family. Everyone thought they understood why Su Lu was so arrogant. This kind of nepotism was the most unacceptable thing in the military, and their hearts became increasingly conflicted. In the dorms at night, one could often hear some officer coldly saying that he was ready to open a paint factory to teach someone a lesson. A week after the arrival of the 17 men, the MX-MEC's first assessment had ended. Most of the officers who had been trained had demonstrated excellent control and combat abilities in the assessment, reaching the passing standard. The ones with the best results were Hua Xiaoxi from Serene and Zhou Yu, who had a deep understanding of the MX-MEC. On the rostrum, Su Lu finished reading out the results and sighed softly. Very satisfied with the results of these 2 months of hard work, he removed the sunglasses on his nose and said to the people below the rostrum, "In half an hour, I'll be waiting for you all at the entrance." The conference room was silent. The trained officers stood up silently and walked towards the door. This silence seemed to hide some kind of hostility. Due to the strict military discipline, they could not do anything to the instructor. Today, they finally had a chance to vent their anger openly, but after all, they were all mid-ranking officers and would not make a big fuss like a hooligan. Instead, they all clenched their fists in excitement. Unexpectedly, half an hour later, Su Lu did not walk with them into the underground hangar, but instead led them to the field. Accompanied by the dull evening breeze, some of the fallen leaves on the field moved slowly. Wearing sunglasses, Su Lu turned his head and said to the officers, "Who is it?" "Me." Hua Xiaoxi from the West Woods Military District stepped forward and glanced calmly at Su Lu, his heart brimming with confidence. He had tied for the highest score in this assessment, and from the very beginning, he had been the one to lead his fellow students in resisting Instructor Su's humiliation. Stepping forward now to challenge on behalf of the officers was only natural. Very natural. Su Lu nodded and said, "After learning MX for so long, you are the most outstanding student. I think you should know very well what MX's main purpose is." This was the question an instructor asked a student. Hua Xiaoxi thought for a moment and then said without hesitation, "It's to kill using physical techniques. To control MX well, other than familiarizing yourself with the operating system, what is the most important tactical quality a pilot should have? Close-range combat." Su Lu unbuttoned the collar of his lieutenant colonel uniform, nodded and said, "You said it very clearly. Then use close-range combat to knock me down, then use mecha. Do you have any objections?" The surrounding officers looked at each other. Although they felt that the instructor's words were slightly different from what they had said at the beginning, these words also made some sense. The key was to use mecha to challenge. With the protection of the safety control system, they could at most make Instructor Su lose some face. Using close-range combat to challenge first was even better. Other than making the instructor lose face, they could also make the instructor's face bruise and vent their anger. As for whether these people would lose or not, they had not considered it. Until today, they still thought that the young instructor Su was a pretty good technical supervisor, an arrogant brat with a great background. If they really fought, how could he be a match for people like them who had been on the battlefield for so long? Without another word, Hua Xiaoxi took off his uniform and began to move the joints of his arms and legs, warming up before the fight. After taking off his clothes, it was discovered that this ace pilot from the West Woods Military District had strong muscles. He was definitely also an expert in close-range combat. The surrounding officers had expressions of schadenfreude on their faces. Now that the test was over, there was naturally no need to maintain absolute courtesy to the instructor. Occasionally, a trace of doubt would flash across the faces of a few people. They felt that there was something wrong with the instructor agreeing to this challenge. However, no one noticed that at the edge of the crowd, 2 officers were staring at Su Lu with cold gazes. They were from the 3rd Military District and had been silent these past few days. Only when the officers found out Su Li's true identity did the coldness in their eyes grow thicker and thicker. The members of Team 7, who were listening and stood far away at the edge of the crowd, leaning against the trees and lying on the stone steps, their figures lazy. They were also very curious about Su Li's strength. Seeing was believing. They wanted to see if their supervisor was as ferocious as Lao Bai had said. Only Zhou Yu laughed bitterly and turned his head away, unwilling to see Hua Xiaoxi's miserable appearance later. "You're the instructor. I won't hit your face." The wind rose on the field. Hua Xiaoxi's face was dark. The moment he attacked, it was the sharpest direct attack of the military special forces. At this time, Su Lu was still wearing his sunglasses. His eyes narrowed under the lenses, and he allowed the fierce wind from the fist to hit him in the face. Only then did his left hand flip up casually, blocking the bend of the opponent's elbow. He took 3 steps forward. The edge of his palm, his fingertips, his wrist, and the hard tip of his elbow sprayed out like raindrops, hitting Hua Xiaoxi's body like a drum. His movements were too fast. It was like countless shadows flashing between the two of them. Hua Xiaoxi barely covered his chest and retreated. He felt a wave of pain and numbness on his body and arm. He couldn't help but turn pale. He didn't know what the instructor's body was made of to be able to reach such a fast speed. Just as everyone was shocked and Hua Xiaoxi was retreating with a grunt, Su Lu suddenly pulled back his fist, raised his right leg, and struck out like a bolt of lightning, hitting the outer side of Hua Xiaoxi's knee. Hua Xiaoxi's strength was all concentrated on the defense of his upper body. His body suddenly lost its balance. Like a scene in a movie, he flipped in the air and then fell tragically onto the hard ground with a muffled thud. "I want votes, I want monthly votes." He clenched his fist and shouted with stars in his eyes. Chapter 327. The field was deathly silent. The officers looked at this scene in disbelief. Some of them had thought that Instructor Su's close combat ability would be extremely strong, which was why they had agreed to this kind of challenge. However, they could never have imagined that Hua Xiaoxi, as an expert of the West Woods Military District, would not even be able to withstand a single blow from Su Lu. After a series of breezes and drizzles, he was beaten into a stiff stick by Su Lu and fell from the air to the ground. Even if it had been a little longer, the officers would have been able to accept this kind of situation easily. However, they only heard a series of muffled sounds that sounded like raindrops hitting sand. Hua Xiaoxi retreated miserably, and then the instructor kicked. Hua Xiaoxi flew up and fell down. They could see that Instructor Little Su seemed to be using the close combat techniques of the military, but it was extremely different in some aspects, especially the feeling when he attacked. Whether it was extending his elbow, knee, or entering the body, each of his actions was clean and efficient, but also extremely fast. He launched with a flick, retracted with a touch. He did not fully extend, but his speed was displayed to the extreme. This kind of close combat method always made the audience feel that Su Lu was like a girl who did not use his full strength. It was difficult for him to use his full strength, but the effect was exceptionally clear and powerful. The final result was so jaw-dropping. He had knocked down Hua Xiaoxi in a single exchange. This kind of close combat ability was a bit too strong. Looking at Su Lu, who was taking off his sunglasses, the officer's eyes finally began to show some kind of reverence and admiration, and also a bit of coldness. The 2 officers with cold gazes looked at each other and frowned, as if they felt that this matter was a bit more difficult to handle. Meanwhile, the members of Team 7 at the periphery of the crowd had already stood up from the stone steps by the tree. With complicated gazes, they stared at Su Lu. At this time, they experienced the evaluation that Bai Yulan had once made, and more or less confirmed the fierceness of their future direct superior. Su Lu took off his sunglasses and reached out to pull up Hua Xiaoxi on the ground. Earlier, when he attacked, he did not use even a sliver of the true power in his body. He completely relied on the 10 postures that were soaked into his bones and the battle instincts he had forged over the years. It was not difficult to defeat the opponent, but he did not cause any real damage to the opponent. "If you can beat me one day, you can try using the mecha again," he said with a smile. The thought of not having to get on the mecha to reveal that he was not as strong as Madman Li made him feel very gratified. Hua Xiaoxi propped up his upper body and spat out a mouthful of sand. He hatefully said, "I underestimated the enemy. Otherwise, I would have been able to hold on a little longer." Soldiers were simple and direct. A loss was a loss. Hua Xiaoxi did not plan on persevering. It was just that he kept feeling that he had been knocked out of his head by the instructor's nagging combat skills. Otherwise, he would have been able to persevere for a while longer. However, as soon as he raised his head, he saw Su Li's extremely sincere smile. His words could not help but stop abruptly. At this moment, he suddenly felt that Instructor Little Su's face without the sunglasses was so amiable with a smile, as if he did not look as hateful as before. No one knew that during the 2 months in the training base, Su Lu had been wearing sunglasses on his nose to hide his smiling, amiable, and harmless eyes. In order to play the role of a cold instructor, he could press the corners of his lips into a sheet of frost, but he still could not do anything about this pair of eyes. After Hua Xiaoxi shook his head and returned to the crowd, Su Lu swept his gaze over the officers around him and said with a smile, "Who else?" No one answered. Although some of the officers believed that their close combat abilities were much stronger than Hua Xiaoxi's, when faced with Instructor Su's seemingly chaotic but actually extremely incisive combat skills, they did not have much confidence in winning. More importantly, at this moment, as they looked at Instructor Su's smiling face and thought about their mecha lessons these past few days, their hearts calmed somewhat. Just like Hua Xiaoxi, that urge to vent his anger that had been somewhat childish to begin with gradually faded away. In the midst of the silence, someone suddenly said in a low voice, "Can it be 2v1? Su Lu looked over with some confusion. To everyone's surprise, after Su Lu had displayed his close combat prowess, the officers who had still stepped forward to issue a challenge were from the 3rd Military Region. They were precisely the 2 people who had been sizing up Su Lu with cold gazes earlier. Perhaps they were very confident in their combat prowess, but strangely, for some reason, they seemed to be constantly looking for a chance to attack Su Lu directly. The officers frowned, thinking to themselves that even with their military ranks, they were not real cadets. Challenging a little instructor and losing was already embarrassing enough, what more when it was 2v1? However, when they recognized these 2 officers, the words they had been about to say turned into ice and snow stuck in their mouths at the same time. The field was silent. The 2 officers who had stepped forward to issue the challenge had been abnormally quiet and dutiful in the past half-year at the base, but in reality, they were particularly eye-catching because these 2 belonged to the 3rd Military Region's trump card, the Iron 7th Division. Every time they thought of the Federal military's most dazzling, yet coldest, young instructor, no one was willing to provoke them, even if the training officers were all geniuses in the military. Everyone knew how cold and heartless that Instructor Du was, yet he was an extremely protective person. If they were able to fight under this kind of commanding officer, it would undoubtedly be the most exciting and happiest thing. However, becoming enemies with the officers under him was definitely an unwise move. Su Li's eyes gradually narrowed as he quietly watched the 2 officers walk out from the crowd. Relying on the ability to see through people's hearts that Uncle Feng Yu greatly admired, he could clearly sense the cold and severe intent hidden under these 2 officers' ordinary faces. Unlike Hua Xiaoxi and the others who challenged him to vent their anger, these two officers clearly had other intentions. One of the officers said coldly, "We are cadets. We want to ask for guidance from Instructor Xiao Su. Please agree." Su Lu was slightly taken aback. He used his hand to comb through his slightly messy hair and tossed the sunglasses in his hand to Zhou Yu. Then, when he raised his right hand and was about to say something, he found that he couldn't seem to find any reason to refuse this challenge. "What are your names?" He wasn't clear about the origins of these two officers. "Chong 1, Chong 2. The two officers replied in a low voice at the same time. "The instructor gave us codenames. From the day we entered the military until the day we retire, we only have codenames." "What instructor?" "The 3rd Military Region's Iron 7th Division." Su Lu had never heard of the Iron 7th Division, so he naturally didn't know that the instructor was such an untouchable and powerful figure. He only sank into deep confusion. He had never been to S3 and had even less of an interaction with the 3rd Military Region, so why were these two officers in front of him like fierce tigers filled with killing intent towards him? The two officers stood on the left and right. Suddenly, they took a deep breath, and all the joints on their bodies started to crackle. What was shocking was that their bodies seemed to swell up along with the crackling sounds, and their uniforms were extremely tight. When the surrounding crowd saw this, they subconsciously expanded their area. Including Hua Xiaoxi, all the officers stared at the field with suspicion and vigilance. They knew very well that the two officers who came out to challenge Su Lu were ranked at the top of the list for close combat in this assessment, and the 3rd Military Region's Iron 7th Division was also an ace troop that was famous for its close combat ferocity. What kind of level did the Special Forces personally trained by such an instructor have? Not to mention, the current state of the two Iron 7th Division officers showed meant that they had once learned some kind of technique in the training hall. With these two officers attacking one, would Instructor Xiao Su be able to hold on? Everyone felt a sense of danger pervading the field. Right now, there was no commanding officer or military police present, but presumably these two officers wouldn't dare to make a move. But for some reason, everyone felt that something dangerous was about to happen. The members of the 7th Division on the periphery had already stood up. They were all skilled soldiers in the forest and could faintly smell the scent of blood. In particular, Xiong Linquan's pupils constricted slightly. Thinking of Bai Yulan's instructions on the sickbed, his palm subconsciously moved to the bottom of the stone steps and applied a bit of force. At this time, Su Lu was still thinking about where the gloominess and hatred in the eyes of the two officers came from. He lowered his head and was silent, his mind wandering. However, before his mind could calm down, a strong wind rushed toward his face. Chong 1 and Chong 2, these two Iron 7th Division close combat experts, stomped their thick-soled military boots on the solid surface of the field. The ground trembled slightly, and two wisps of light smoke rose into the air. The two of them were like fierce tigers leaping down from a cliff. In an instant, they closed the distance between them and Su Lu and attacked him, who had his head lowered in thought. One of them punched toward Su Li's chin, while the other moved close to his body and raised his knee to attack the base of his thigh. The attack was extremely ruthless, and the wind whistled as it broke through the air. This might have been a sneak attack, and it might have been somewhat shameless, but with the challenge before them, Su Lu acquiesced. These two officers of the Iron 7th Division would always be able to find some excuse afterward. Furthermore, with the arrow on the bow and the fist in front of them, regardless of whether it was the audience or the person involved, they could only watch as this scene unfolded. Su Lu suddenly raised his head, and a trace of anger flashed through his slightly narrowed eyes. His anger wasn't because of the sinister and vicious attacks of the officers, but because he still didn't understand why they hated him. In a flash, his state of mind was as steady as a rock. Just like in the countless dangerous moments in the past, he calmly took a step forward. His body was like a nail nailed to the ground. At the same time, he flipped his left hand and grabbed Chang Won's wrist, who was attacking his chin. His right leg swung to the right and slapped the inside of Chang Tu's knee with the outer edge of his thigh. If he had been dealing with an ordinary person, with the reaction speed and skill he displayed at this moment, this would have been a perfect response. According to the usual development of close-range combat, Su Lu would have closed in on his opponent again and used his iron shoulder to push one of them away. At the same time, his left hand would follow the opponent's elbow joint and stab the other person's armpit. One punch would numb the opponent's blood and make him unable to continue fighting. However, what Su Lu did not expect was that although his left hand grabbed Chang Won's wrist, what his fingertips touched was like an old tree root. In particular, the fine muscles on Chang Won's wrist suddenly tightened and jumped horizontally, like the skin of an old tree root bursting. This made his 3 fingers unable to wedge into the other's muscle fibers. And when he leaned violently to the right, it was like leaning against a thick wall. Not only did he not push the other away, but he also exposed his right rib to Chang Tu's attack. Su Lu would never underestimate any of his enemies, but he didn't treat these 2 officers as irreconcilable enemies. He hadn't used a single vicious move, hadn't mobilized a single strand of the violent power in his body, yet in the end, he had lost the initiative. The 2 officers of the Iron 7th Division did not let go of this opportunity. A cold light flashed in their eyes as they attacked Su Li's vital points. With 2 muffled sounds, the 3 people on the field quickly blocked a few times. Like 3 shadows, the shadows turned into concrete bodies in an instant. The situation on the field had changed completely. The 2 officers of the 3rd Military Region had broken through Su Li's defense and used the exact same method to get close to him. They grabbed his wrist with one hand and blocked under his armpit with the other, waiting for the right moment to exert force. This was the most vicious close-range combat technique, the anti-joint technique. If these 2 officers were allowed to unleash their full strength, even if Su Li's shoulder joint was still intact, the cartilage in his elbow would definitely shatter into pieces. The 2 officers of the Iron 7th Division did not immediately press down on Su Lu. They just maintained this posture, as if they wanted to show the surrounding officers what would happen if Su Lu was defeated. They looked coldly at Su Li's face, who was right in front of them. They were not worried that Su Lu would be able to win because no matter how big the difference in strength between the 2 sides was, they already had the absolute advantage. Using the simplest lever theory in physics, Su Lu, whose arms were blocked, was unable to exert any force at all. The spectating officers had felt a strange sense of danger when the challenge started. However, when they saw that the 2 of them had defeated instructor Xiao Su in one fell swoop, they thought that even though the 2 of them were Iron 7th Master's Icemen, they still wouldn't dare to hurt an instructor as students. Thus, they heaved a sigh of relief. Only Xiong Linquan, who was standing at the edge of the crowd, had the coldness in his eyes getting deeper and deeper. His 5 fingers that were grabbing onto the stone steps behind him started to exert force. His knuckles turned white, and he was actually able to lift the stone steps that weighed dozens of kilograms by an inch. The atmosphere was very silent, very strange, and very awkward. As an instructor, Su Lu was completely controlled by 2 students. Although he was younger than these officers and had no experience in the military, nor did he have a record of killing people, he was still an instructor. At this moment, he couldn't help but feel a little humiliated. Instructor said that strength is strength when speed is multiplied by strength. The limit of an individual's strength is constant. Chang Yi looked at his face that was close by, and his eyes were full of ridicule and indifference. He said in a lecturing tone, "The faster the speed, the lighter the strength of the punch. You're just playing with fancy moves, but we, the people of the Iron 7th Division, are not as weak as those guys." Both of his arms were blocked, and his joints were restrained. Human physiology and basic physics confirmed that Su Lu was completely restrained, So this Iron 7th Division officer was in the mood to appreciate his failure and ridicule his incompetence. "I admit defeat," Su Lu said directly with a smile. He wasn't obsessed with winning or losing. On the contrary, he was obsessed with the opponent's hatred for him, and he really wanted to know how far the Iron 7th Division officer wanted to go. The officer didn't expect Su Lu to admit defeat so easily. After a slight pause, he said fiercely, "I don't accept. You're an instructor. If we kill you, we'll definitely have to go to military court. But I think if we just break your arms, there shouldn't be too much of a problem." His eyes were cold and ruthless. He said in a low voice, "In close combat, there are often accidental injuries like this, right?" The conversation in the field was very low and fast, so the officers in the crowd didn't hear it at all. They wondered why instructor Xiao Su still didn't admit defeat. Su Lu was silent for a moment, then lowered his head and said, "Since it's revenge, let me know the reason. Then I'll feel better, right? Park Ji-ho is someone that the Iron 7th Division wants." Chang Yi said coldly, "I'm from the same yard as him." Su Lu raised his head, an indescribable emotion flashing through his eyes. Almost at the same time, the two Iron 7th Division officers' eyes flashed fiercely. Their muscles tightened, and they clamped their arms around his elbow joint, pressing down hard. Not all the people in the crowd were combat experts, but as outstanding officers that the Federation focused on grooming, they definitely had a sharp and accurate eye. When the two Iron 7th Division officers lowered their shoulders and crossed their legs, at least half of the people in the crowd could see what they were going to do next. It was just a very common camp challenge. The winner was already decided, but who would have thought that it wasn't over yet? In these past 2 months, the officers had hated MX Mecha class to the core. However, after passing the assessment, they no longer hated instructor Little Su for wearing sunglasses and pretending to be cool. Deeply educated in discipline and self-control, they knew very well that upholding the original challenge agreement today was more of a tradition of steel in the military camp. In some ways, this was just a game between men. But these two people from the Iron 7th Division were actually going to break instructor Xiao Su's arm in front of everyone on the field. Could it be that the soldiers raised by Commander Du of the Iron 7th Division were so cold and cruel that they weren't even afraid of the military law? Or could it be that because they had the Iron 7th Division as their backing, they didn't care about the military law at all? In the midst of the shock, Lan Xiaolong and Zhou Yu's expressions changed drastically, and they immediately started to move. But there was one person who reacted faster than them. Outside the crowd, there was a crisp sound as the stone steps were lifted up by someone. Xiong Linquan roared as he held the heavy concrete steps with both hands. Like a deity, he shook the crowd and rushed over before the other two. He valiantly smashed the stone steps down. With a muffled boom, the heavy concrete steps smashed into the ground, creating a crater. In the blink of an eye, the stone steps, which weighed who knew how many kilograms, were shattered by the huge force. Debris flew everywhere and dust flew everywhere. However, Xiong Linquan, who had rushed over like a god, spread out his hands and stared blankly at where the stone steps had landed. He blinked in shock, and didn't feel that the web between his thumb and index finger had been split open and was bleeding. There was a suffocating silence in the field, because his thunderous attack missed. 3 meters before the stone steps landed, the three people who were tangled up with each other still maintained their previous postures, as if they hadn't moved at all. The only reason they were able to dodge this terrifying attack was because at the last moment, someone still had the strength to force the other two people to take 3 steps back. There was only one person who could do this. The pupils of the two Iron 7th Division officers shrank as they stared at Su Li's face in horror. When they attacked with all their might, they found that Su Li's arm didn't break as they had imagined. It didn't even bend. This completely violated the physiological structure and physics of the human body. Su Li's arm seemed to be cast from iron. Chapter 328. Xiong Linquan smashed down the stone stairs. Su Lu, whose arms were restrained, dragged the two officers of the Iron 7th Division back a few steps in a flash. Logically speaking, he was unable to exert any strength, but he was able to use the strength of one person to move the bodies of three people. This only proved that he was in control of the situation the entire time. It was only now that the two officers of the Iron 7th Division knew that they had encountered a real iron plate. In the previous fight between Su Lu and Hua Xiaoxi, he had only displayed the most accurate and fast aspects of close-range combat. His true strength had been hidden the entire time. With a single misjudgment, the two officers immediately fell into a predicament. They had already pressed down on Su Li's elbow joint with all their strength, but it had no effect at all. It was like two insects wailing and waving their chelicerae, but they couldn't leave a single mark on a thick iron rod. Su Li's tone was very normal. He was indeed very strong. He had trained with Uncle Fengyu for so many years. After coming to the capital ring, other than Madman Li, he had never met anyone who could face him head-on. The ruthless anti-joint technique was completely ineffective. The two officers of the Iron 7th Division had a flash of fear in their eyes. Chang Won's face was pale. A hint of despair and desperation flashed through his eyes. His hands gave up on the idea of suppressing instructor Su Li's elbow joint. Like two poisonous snakes, they wrapped around his arm. With a whistling sound, he raised his fist and punched straight at the corner of Su Li's eye. At this moment, he still hadn't given up and used a ruthless move that was enough to kill. Previously, Su Li's fingers had been repelled by the muscles on Chang Won's wrist. He couldn't grasp it because Chang Won had learned some thrusting kung fu in the Iron 7th Division and the Body Cultivation Hall. His body was very strong, but more importantly, he hadn't used his true terrifying strength. At this moment, a stream of heat gushed out from behind his waist, spreading to his limbs and torso. Every pair of muscle fibers were rubbing against each other, and every cell seemed to be expanding and breathing. Strong and unparalleled strength filled his entire body. How could he give his opponent a chance to counterattack? With a flip of his palm, his thumb and index finger were like two iron pincers. They gripped the joint of Chang Won's upper left arm. Gathering strength at the tip of his finger, it suddenly shot out. With a ripping sound, it tore apart the sturdy military uniform and viciously clawed into the other's shoulder joint. A wave of intense pain and numbness rushed into Chang Yi's mind at the same time. The fist that was viciously aimed at the corner of Su Li's eye was still in midair, but like a viper that had been frozen to death, it went limp and limp. Since he had already made his move, he naturally wouldn't stop. Su Lu expressionlessly took a step forward. With two muffled thuds, one knee struck the inside of Chang Won's knee. At the same time, his right hip pushed Chang Tu some distance away. Compared to Chang Won, the other officer appeared to be more well-behaved, so Su Lu didn't use too much force. Instead, he took advantage of the momentum of the collision to raise his right leg again. Just like how he had kicked Hua Xiaoxi earlier, it strangely drew an arc outside his body and viciously chopped down on his thigh. These movements seemed ordinary, but Su Lu executed them with incomparable speed. Furthermore, the rhythm of each movement was very beautiful. It was simple and smooth to the extreme, making it impossible for his opponent to react. These were the 10 postures that the uncle had taught him, and they had been integrated into his blood. During battle, he did not need to use his brain to think at all. Relying on the situation in the field and his instincts, he naturally displayed them. However, this fierce kick was not taught to him by Uncle. It was more than 2 years ago when he saw Captain Tian's sharp kick on the ancient Bell spaceship. His heart trembled and he pondered over it day and night. Only then did he combine the intent of this kick with the 10 postures, which became his favorite attack method. However, this kick was qualitatively different from the one that had hit Hua Xiaoxi earlier. This was because Su Lo had channeled all the mysterious power in his body into his tibia. When he kicked Hua Xiaoxi, he did not use much force, so Hua Xiaoxi was sent flying. However, this kick was already as sharp as a knife. Its speed and power were extremely terrifying. Chang Tu, whose thigh was hit, felt a huge force hit him. His body could not fly at all, so he had to bear the full brunt of this force. With a heart-chilling crack, Chang Er let out a muffled groan, his face pale. He was not kicked into the air, but like an old tree that was blown down by a huge gust of wind, he fell heavily onto the ground, unable to get up again. After kicking Chang Tu down, Su Li's other hand was still tightly gripping Chang One's upper arm joint. Blood was faintly seeping out from his fingertip. Since Su Lu already knew the reason for this ruthless Iron 7th Division officer's ruthlessness, he naturally would not hold back. However, this was a training base after all. The other party was a Federation officer, so he did not think of killing him on the spot. Otherwise, he would probably end up in prison again the moment he stepped out of a lure. At this time, Chang Wan still did not know that his companion had lost his ability to fight. He felt his right arm joint being gripped by the other party's iron clamp-like hand. He was unable to mobilize his strength. A strong sense of unwillingness and viciousness made his mind a little dizzy. He raised his leg and kicked at Su Li's lower abdomen. His empty left hand viciously stabbed at Su Li's eyes. In the beginning, these two Iron 7th Division officers only wanted to humiliate Su Lu by breaking his arms during combat training. Once he realized that something was amiss, Chang Wan became bold. He did not care about Su Li's identity as an instructor and used an absolutely forbidden move. This included the punch that had been aimed at the corner of Su Li's eyes, as well as the current kick and stab. No matter which action it was, it could have taken Su Li's life or left him with irreparable damage. Looking at the two fingers that were getting closer and closer to his eyes, Su Li's eyes suddenly brightened. A hint of viciousness flashed through his eyes. He retracted his left hand as fast as lightning and then struck out horizontally. Back in Linyuan, Madman Li had thrown 3 horizontal punches, but Su Lu had taken all 3 of them head-on. Today, Su Lu was also using this kind of unreasonable horizontal punch. He did not care about the fingers in front of him or the military boots that were about to reach his lower abdomen. He threw out a brutal and terrifying punch. Absolute strength and speed were like the occasional torrent of rays that wreaked havoc among the stars. No matter what kind of intricate techniques or insidious responses the opponent had, they would all be blown into disarray by this kind of absolute realm. It was an indescribable tragedy. Amidst the tearing sounds, the sleeve of Su Li's military uniform on his forearm was torn into pieces by the force of the pulsating force. The 2 fingers that were thrusting toward Su Li's eyes like a viper first met the horizontal punch. As expected, the knuckles shattered with a crisp sound. Chang Yi's eyes were full of fear. He did not pay attention to the intense pain in his left hand. With a roar, he pulled back his right arm to block his cheek before the fierce fist could reach his face. However, if Su Lu could block Madman Li's horizontal punch, how could this officer of the Iron 7th Division be able to block it? With a loud boom, Su Li's horizontal punch struck the other's vertical arm. Chang Wan's body trembled violently as he stumbled back 7 steps. However, in the end, he was unable to withstand the powerful torrent of energy and fell to the ground in a tragic manner. He rolled backwards like a rolling gourd, rolling all the way until he was out of the crowd of dumbfounded onlookers. After rolling for more than 20 meters, he finally stopped. His limbs went limp as he lay on the ground and fainted. How much strength was needed to send someone more than 20 meters away with one punch? There was a deathly silence. Xiong Linquan, who was still bleeding from the web between his thumb and index finger, looked at Su Lu in disbelief. He felt an unprecedented chill in his heart. He thought that not only was Lao Bai right, but he also seemed to have underestimated Supervisor Su's strength. Sulu pulled back his fist and looked down. He wiped the traces of blood from his fingertips on his military uniform and walked toward Chang'e, who was outside the crowd. Chang'e was at his feet. His thigh was at least fractured, but his life was not in danger, so he did not need to worry. Seeing Instructor Xiao Su walk toward the unconscious Chang'e, the military cadets had shocked and complicated expressions. They did not know if Instructor Xiao Su had been angered by these two officers of the Iron 7th Division and was not willing to give up. He wanted to beat them to death. Lan Xiaolong and Zhou Yu looked at each other and forcibly suppressed the shock in their hearts. They walked to Su Li's side and whispered a few words. Su Lu shook his head and walked to Chang Yi's side. Looking at the unconscious officer, he said, "Call the medical team over." Chang Yi, who was unconscious on the field, had 2 fingers on his left hand that were completely shattered. Placed beside him, they looked as ugly as the chicken claws sold in the black market. What was even more frightening was that the upper arm that he used to protect his face was already fractured, and the power contained in Su Li's punch had passed through his arm bone and caused his lower jaw to be slightly deformed. A few broken teeth flew out with blood. It was truly a tragic sight to behold. This triggered Su Li's ruthless state of mind. Even though he had tried his best to protect his face, it was a pity that his face, which could not be considered handsome, could not be preserved. Fortunately, the medical and logistical support in the training base was very strong, so he probably would not die just like that. The fight on the field naturally caused a huge uproar in the training base. The 2 officers, who had passed all the examinations and were about to participate in the graduation drill, had been beaten by their instructors in school. One of them had a fractured thigh bone, while the other was seriously injured and unconscious. No matter what, this was a major incident that required investigation. The National Defense Department authorized the base to conduct an independent investigation. The base's investigation naturally would not pay attention to the fight between Instructor Su and Hua Xiaoxi. Instead, the focus of the investigation was placed on the latter. Su Lu was not worried about the results of the investigation because it was the officers who had initiated the challenge. Furthermore, he strictly abided by his duties as an instructor. He had never thought of returning a heavy blow. Even though the other party had disregarded the difference in military ranks, fought 2 against 1, and even tried to seriously injure him after gaining the upper hand. During the entire process of the fight, it was not until the officer named Chang Yi used lethal and ruthless attacks again and again that the ruthlessness in his heart surged to teach the other party a lesson. He firmly believed that he was in the right. The results of the follow-up investigation also proved this point. There were a total of 50 people on the field who had witnessed the entire process with their own eyes. Even if the 17 people of Team 7 were not included, there were still many officers who testified to the base's investigation team. Instructor Su had not done anything wrong in this matter. He had only been forcefully dragged into danger by the other party, so he had no choice but to use a heavy blow to protect himself. The officers had always held great opinions and contempt for Su Lu. However, at this time, the contempt had disappeared without a trace with the ability Su Lu displayed. They were the most outstanding officers in the Federation. Naturally, they were not willing to violate military discipline in order to punish Su Lu. Moreover, soldiers had their own personal integrity. However, other than 5 officers who maintained their silence, everyone else stood on Su Li's side in the investigation. One day later, the 2 injured officers of the Iron 7th Division left the base and were sent by military aircraft to the Army General Hospital for treatment. The results of the base's investigation were not conclusive. Su Lu was called by the base's commanding officer to have a talk. He was not reprimanded. What puzzled him was that the 2 officers who had caused trouble were not disciplined either. Because they were selected by the Iron 7th Division, even the base did not want to cause any more trouble and reported the disciplinary action. Su Lu sat at the innermost table in the cafeteria with a thermal lunchbox in his hand. He couldn't help but frown as he thought about the news he had heard from the Zhou family. After this incident, he called Zhou Yu and asked her to help investigate the relationship between Park Ji-ho and the Iron 7th Division. During the fight, the officer of the Iron 7th Division, Chang Yi, thought that he was going to win and coldly said that they were going to avenge Park Ji-ho. Thinking about this, Su Lu became a little vigilant. He often thought about the hatred the Park family had for him in the District Procurator General's office, especially when he remembered the saliva of Park Ji-ho's younger sister and the frosty words of Park Ji-ho's widow in the car. He knew that the hatred of murder would never disappear. He couldn't rest assured until he figured out the true relationship between the Iron 7th Division and Park Ji-ho. Zhou Yu was the daughter of the Minister of National Defense. Under the personal guidance of Lady Tai, she had traveled extensively in the past few years. It was easy for her to investigate this matter. In just one night, she called back. It turned out that the Park family had been living in S3. Park Ji-ho's father used to be a logistics officer in the Iron 7th Division. After he retired from the military, the whole family moved to S1. When Park Ji-ho was young, he had lived in the Iron 7th Division's compound and had a good relationship with the people in the division. More importantly, Park Ji-ho had entered the 2nd Military Academy under the name of the Iron 7th Division. His performance in the academy was excellent. As long as he completed the National Defense Department's all-rounder training program, he would definitely return to the Iron 7th Division after a year of training in the Nutshell Company. In a sense, the Park Ji-ho that Su Lu killed at the entrance of Husan Road was the Iron 7th Division's main training target. Zhou Yu warned Su Lu on the phone that he should keep a safe distance from the Iron 7th Division in the future. This was because the Trump Card Division of the 3rd Military Region was famous for being very protective of their own people. Su Lu didn't understand. His backer in the Federation was really powerful. Could it be that there was really someone in the federal military who was willing to cause trouble for him? Zhou Yu didn't explain too much on the phone. After all calls in and out of the base were monitored, so there were many things that couldn't be explained. She just seriously reminded Su Lu that the Iron 7th Division was a special force in the federal military. It was very strong, and the commander of this division, Commander Du, wasn't someone to be trifled with. If they really got into a fight, even her father wouldn't be able to say anything. Iron 7th Division. Su Lu shook his head with a bitter smile. Killing Park Ji-ho wasn't something that he planned. It was the other party's plot to harm him, and they ran into his knife. The knife flashed at the entrance of Husan Road. Park Ji-ho was dead, and he was still alive. In the eyes of the Park family and the Iron 7th Division, he was probably a shameless murderer who used the Tai family to escape justice, and Park Ji-ho was an innocent military officer who died at a young age. When he thought of this, he couldn't help but feel a little dignified and unhappy. He didn't feel guilty about killing Park Ji-ho, but he also didn't really want to provoke the Iron 7th Division. Even if Zhou Yu didn't warn him, he would have stayed away from the Iron 7th Division in the future. All the courses of the training plan had been completed, and there was going to be a small-scale tactical exercise the day after tomorrow. The instructors from the Federation had already left the base. Only Su Lu hadn't received any further orders from the Ministry of Defense, so he had to stay at the base for the time being. Tonight was the base's banquet. More than 30 military officers were talking loudly in the cafeteria. They were gobbling down food, drinking wine, and hugging each other's shoulders. They were very enthusiastic. After more than half a year of training, these military officers had developed a lot of feelings for each other. They used to be comrades, but now there was a sense of camaraderie. They all knew that they were going to be sent to the front line in the West Woods soon. After today's departure, they didn't know when they would see each other again. Perhaps they would never see each other again. Naturally, there was a lot of emotion and reluctance. Tonight in the cafeteria, who knew how many military regulations had been violated? However, the base understood the emotions of these military officers, especially when they knew that these people would become high-ranking military officers after they left. They didn't want to cross the line, so they acquiesced to their nonsense. As they drank and drank, even Team 7, who had been watching from the sidelines at the beginning, was pulled into the drinking competition by these military officers. In the words of the military officers, although you guys are a little rough, you're really good at fighting. You guys haven't been classmates for a long time, but in the future, if you want to join my army, I'll definitely welcome you with open arms. No one paid any attention to Su Lu, who was sitting in the deepest corner. Su Lu didn't care either. For him, his 2+ months of life at the training base was just a promise he made to President Pabre and the Ministry of Defense. Or rather, it should be said that it was a job. He ate by himself with the lunchbox in his hand. At this moment, Lan Xiaolong came over with 2 plates of food and 2 wine glasses. He said with a smile, "It's so lively over there. Why are you pretending to be lonely here?" Su Lu smiled and said, "I like liveliness, but it seems that liveliness has never liked me." Lan Xiaolong thought for a moment and asked, "What are you thinking about?" "I'm thinking about that Iron 7th Division." Su Lu was silent for a moment and said, "I've offended this teacher too much this time. I'll have to stay away from him in the future." Lan Xiaolong poured him a glass of wine and said, "Let me tell you a piece of bad news. At the graduation ceremony the day after tomorrow, the headquarters of these military officers will send people to pick them up. The Iron 7th Division will also send people." Su Lu narrowed his eyes. The Ministry of Defense values this training very much. Lan Xiaolong looked at the wine glass and said with slight worry, "The Iron 7th Division will send people to pick them up. It's the teacher Du Chongqing." Chapter 329. Division Commander Du Shaoqing. Su Lu was both unfamiliar and familiar with this name. Before these few days, he didn't even know that the 3rd Military Region had an unbreakable Iron 7 Division, much less that the division commander of the Iron 7 Division was called Du Shaoqing. But after Zhou Yu's warning over the phone, he had developed a natural sense of vigilance towards this name. Du Shaoqing. These 3 words were written as thin as bones, but they were filled with the aura of steel. When read aloud, these 3 monosyllabic words seemed to have some sort of lethality when they came out of anyone's mouth. Even Lan Xiaolong, who said them with a hint of worry, still felt this way. Su Lu was silent for a long time. The reason why this division commander's name could make him feel so emotional was all because of those 2 fearless officers and the tolerance the base had for the Iron 7 Division. Combined, it seemed that when people mentioned this division commander, their emotions would become somewhat unnatural, and they would feel a sense of reverence from the bottom of their hearts. But this was just a division commander. Just as he was about to ask Lan Xiaolong about the Iron 7 Division, the officers who were making a ruckus suddenly quietened down. This was because Zhou Yu had just walked over to the table in the corner with a glass of wine in his hand. Everyone quietly watched this scene. Everyone laughed and drank while Su Lu sat alone in the corner. This couldn't be considered a deliberate exclusion. It was just a natural boundary between the instructor and the students. Moreover, the 2 sides hadn't gotten along very well in the past few months. But Zhou Yu's action seemed to be breaking some sort of boundary. Zhou Yu smiled and lowered his body, clinking his glass with Su Li's and said, "These past 2 months, you've been teaching them attentively. They're actually very grateful, but they just can't bring themselves to come over." Su Lu didn't think about the Iron 7 Division again. He laughed self-deprecatingly and said, "It's just work." Zhou Yu had once followed the entire development of the MX Mecha in the Nutshell Engineering Department, so he naturally knew that Su Lu had really given his all in these 2 months, teaching all he knew about the MX Mecha to these officers. The federal military didn't have a standard tutorial for the MX mecha in the first place. What Sulu did was beneficial to the federal military, but its effects could be maintained for a long time. Sulu looked at him and smiled. In the past 2 months, Zhou had not had much personal contact with him. He knew very well that this was some sort of unspoken rule in the military camp, so he did not understand why the other party wanted to break this rule today. Zhou seemed to have guessed what he was thinking. He smiled warmly and said, "We're about to graduate. There's no need to worry about anything else. Regardless of what others think, I still have to thank you. You're the one who doesn't need to thank me. With your understanding of MX, you'll be able to grasp it immediately even without these lessons." Sulu downed the wine in his cup in one gulp. His chest felt slightly spicy, and he exhaled a breath that reeked of alcohol. Pursing his lips, he smiled and said, "Just like how you were in the first Academy's mecha faculty. You're still number 1. Zhou broke the invisible dividing line in the canteen. After a moment of silence, a person whom Sulu had not expected also walked over with a wine cup in his hand. This officer had a serious expression on his face. He lightly clinked his cup with Sulu and said in a deep voice, "Commanding Officer of the Westwoods Special Mecha Battalion, Hua Xiaoxi. Thank you, Instructor Su, for your hard work these past 2 months." Sulu stared at Hua Xiaoxi's dark face and was speechless. The spicy feeling in his chest turned into warmth. He smiled but didn't say anything. He only drank the full cup of wine that Lan Xiaolong had poured for him and drank with the other. Hua Xiaoxi gave him a formal military salute and then turned around to return to his own table. There wasn't any irreconcilable hatred to begin with. The stiff mood between Sulu and the officers was mostly caused by the unique atmosphere in the military camp. This kind of mood came and went quickly. The officers had already noticed that after the assessment, Instructor Little Su no longer wore those damn sunglasses. His smile was so amiable that it was as bright as the sun. When they looked back, they realized that the sarcastic and mean instructor in the past was just a mask that he had deliberately put on. And after Sulu perfectly demonstrated his ability from theory to actual combat, the humiliation and shock they had received in class was gradually thrown to the back of the officers' minds. With this kind of situation as a prerequisite, Sulu only needed an opportunity to break the silence between him and the officers. Zhou and Hua Xiaoxi's toasts were precisely this opportunity. A small and thin officer walked over with a smile and said, "First Military Region's Mechanical Automation Research Institute, Captain Lin AI." After saying this captain drained the wine in his cup in one gulp, gave a military salute, and then turned to leave. Second Military Region's 11th Automated Army Group, Major He. Federal Fleet's Circular Base, Captain Mizuru. With this as the beginning, after a moment of contemplation, more and more officers walked over with wine cups to toast Sulu. In the end, they actually formed groups of 2 or 3. There was an endless stream of people who came and went to toast. Other than the solemn and formal introductions of the troops and military ranks they belonged to, during the process of toasting, Sulu and the officers were silent. They didn't say a word, but their eyes were filled with smiles. Suli's eyes were smiling like 2 crescent moons. Their gazes met, and there was an indescribable tacit understanding. Lan Xiaolong smiled as he poured wine for Sulu. His cup was never empty. After a round of toasting, the 2 bottles of strong wine he had brought over had long been finished. The crowd around the table gradually dispersed. Lan Xiaolong looked at the gradually intoxicated Sulu and couldn't help but sigh in praise. Wine doesn't make one drunk, but one gets drunk. The friendship between teacher and student, the relationship between teacher and student, you've taught so many future cornerstones of the Federation. In the future, on the battlefield, just how abundant of a capital will this be? It was unknown what kind of emotion it was, but it made Sulu feel that the cafeteria was filled with a solemn and warm feeling. He drank close to 2 gin of strong wine, and his drunkenness had long entered his brain. He narrowed his eyes and looked at those officers who were at the peak of their lives. He thought that perhaps in a few more days, they would follow their respective troops to the front lines. In the battle against the Empire's invaders, they would spill their hot blood in exchange for the peace of the Federation's people. These faces, whether fat or thin, beautiful or ugly, perhaps would never be seen again in the future. With this thought, hot blood poured into his chest. If it were someone else, perhaps at this moment, they would have slammed the table, stood up, and gathered the officers in front of them. They would loudly and powerfully speak about youth, hot-bloodedness, and sacrifice. However, Sulu was just Sulu. He couldn't do this kind of thing. He remained silent as usual. He narrowed his eyes and looked at those officers. He put the bottle to his mouth and drank the remaining wine in the bottle in one gulp. His chest wasn't carefree, but at least it was somewhat satisfying. However, there were still 5 officers in the cafeteria. They sat silently at their small tables. They didn't take advantage of the alcohol to play with those officers, pour out their hearts, or curse the Empire's dogs. Instead, they coldly watched all of this. Lan Xiaolong stared in that direction. He moved close to Su Li's ear and said softly, "The 5 officers who didn't toast are all from the Iron 7th Division." The officers from the Iron 7th Division naturally wouldn't toast to Su Lu. However, whether it was because of the Iron 7th Division's strict discipline or some other reason, the 5 officers at the table didn't even pay attention to the other officers. It was a bit strange in the cafeteria. What shocked Su Lu wasn't this strange atmosphere, but Lan Xiaolong's reminder. He originally thought that the Iron 7th Division only sent 2 officers to the base for training. At this time, he had already beaten them to the Army General Hospital. He didn't expect that there were actually 5 officers from the Iron 7th Division in the base. The Federation specially organized an anti-terrorism exercise and carefully selected 30 officers to participate in this secret training. It was hoped that these people would be able to independently support a side of the war in the future. However, just the Iron 7th Division alone took up 7 of the spots. How many divisions were there in the federal military? The Iron 7th Division alone took up 1/5 of the quota. Su Li's heart was filled with endless shock. What kind of division was this? How strong was the training level and military quality of this division to be able to achieve such shocking results? To be able to train such a division? What kind of person was Du Shaoqing? Thinking about the matter between himself and the Iron 7th Division, and how he had just destroyed 2 officers from the Iron 7th Division who had limitless futures, Su Li's drunkenness actually subsided a little. His eyes were still bright, but he narrowed them even more. Lan Xiaolong saw his mood and asked with a frown, "You don't know about the Iron 7th Division?" Su Lu shook his head. When Lan Xiaolong realized that he was not a real soldier, he showed a look of understanding. From Lan Xiaolong's description, Su Lu learned about the shocking history and exceptionally strange current situation of the Iron 7th Division. The 7th Mechanic Division of the 3rd Military Region, during the Second Defensive War of the Federation, ushered in a bloody battle at the Huiming Corridor in the West Wood. Facing 3 reorganized brigades of the Empire, the division alone completed an unbelievable mission on administrative planet 5460, which bought precious time for the Federation's main forces to surround the Empire. However, the 7th Division paid a huge price for this, suffering heavy casualties and losing a large number of people. It could be said that the entire division was buried in that planet filled with blood and smoke. During the post-war reorganization, the 7th Division, whose division commander and company commander all died on the battlefield, almost had its designation revoked. However, at this time, the Federation's news channel broadcasted a tragic video recording of the Iron 7th Division's sniper attack. This caused a huge uproar within the Federation. The Veteran Association, which had already begun to show its power at that time, organized an angry demonstration that directly surrounded the Parliament Hill and the President's residence. Under this kind of pressure, the federal military had no choice but to withdraw the order to revoke the 7th Division's designation. Instead, they announced that they had begun to rebuild the division. Whether it was equipment or personnel, they allocated to the 7th Division according to the status of an absolute ace. They also gave the Mechanic Division the title of Iron 7th Division. The glory of the Iron 7th Division spread throughout the universe until the god of war, Li Bofu, left his division. Only then did the 1st Military Region's 17th Armored Division completely overwhelm the Iron 7th Division, establishing its position as the Federation's #1 division. The once glorious Iron 7th Division, due to certain reasons, gradually disappeared from the Federation's people's memories. Why is that? Su Lo held the beer bottle tightly and listened to Lan Xiaolong's narration seriously. His mood fluctuated along with the bloody history of the Iron 7th Division. His vigilance and resistance toward the name Iron 7th Division gradually turned into a trace of disappointment. There are many theories, most of which are related to the evaluation of Battle 5460. Many big shots in the military have always had doubts about the process of that battle. Later, due to the pressure of public opinion, they rebuilt the division, but they didn't want to pay attention to it anymore. It seems to be a scar on our history. Lan Xiaolong said faintly, "Those big shots are long dead. No one knows the truth of history." However, just as the Iron 7th Division was stationed in S3 for decades and was so lonely that only the name of the Iron 7th Division remained, Du Shaoqing, who had graduated from the 1st Academy, came to this forgotten corner. The story of the Iron 7th Division began once again. Chapter 330. Du Shaoqing was 37 years old this year. After he graduated from the 1st Military Academy, he was directly recruited by the Department of Defense and transferred to the 3rd Military Region. He requested to enter the 7th Mechanic Division and become the commander of the division's independent battalion. S3 had always been located on the side of the capital ring. It enjoyed the wealth of the Federation and was far away from the flames of war and political struggles. Its people were simple and peaceful, and it gradually became a star system that was ignored by the people of the Federation. The 7th Mechanic Division, which was stationed in the capital of the administrative planet of S3, was naturally ignored and almost forgotten by the people because they were disliked by the upper echelons of the military. However, just 1 year after Du Shaoqing officially entered the 7th Mechanic Division, in a routine military exercise organized by the 3rd Military Region of the Federation, the 7th Mechanic Division that had been silent for a long time suddenly shone brightly. In more than a month of comprehensive military exercises, the 7th Mechanic Division gave the headquarters of the 3rd Military Region a huge surprise. Mobility test, quick reaction ability, automatic digital combat ability. There were a total of 17 test indicators, and the 7th Mechanic Division actually obtained first place in 15 of them, obtaining an uncontested and overwhelming victory. At that time, the unit that represented the 7th Mechanic Division in the comprehensive military exercise was the independent battalion led by Du Shaoqing. After this battle, it was as if the dust on the 7th Division had been washed away by someone. With strict discipline, daunting and arduous training, and the explosive advancement of the commanders at all levels, the 7th Division had become an intimidating steel fighting machine. After that, in 3 consecutive military exercises, the 7th Mechanic Division obtained consecutive victories easily and silently, shocking the entire 3rd Military Region. Even the Department of Defense expressed concern. After that, the 7th Mechanic Division began to represent the 3rd Military Region to participate in large-scale military exercises organized by the Federation. Whether it was the interplanetary support landing battle or the deep strike battle, the 7th Mechanic Division displayed their incomparable combat ability, crushing their brothers and sisters like dry weed. Other than these large-scale military exercises, the soldiers that the 7th Mechanic Division sent to participate in the Federation's small-scale training, military camp competitions, and anti-terrorism exercises would always obtain victory coldly. Ever since Du Shaoqing came to the 7th Mechanic Division, the division had always gotten first place in every federal military assessment that they participated in. They had never gotten second place once. The federal military was as strong as a forest. It was not difficult to get first place in so many exercises. However, if they got first place every time, it could only mean that the training level of the division and the commanding ability of the commander were excellent to the extreme. During the drill, the Iron 7 Division displayed incomparably strict military discipline and incomparably powerful combat ability. The federal military watched in shock as the 7th Mechanic revealed his brilliance and approached the name of the Iron 7th Division step by step. As for the rest of the troops, they watched this scene with vigilance, unease, and admiration. Getting first place in 37 military exercises in a row had firmly engraved the name of the Iron 7th Division in the Federal Military's honor book. No one knew if there would be a division that could do this in the future, but in the past tens of thousands of years of history, there had never been a division that had been able to win like the Iron 7th Division for 8 years. The 3rd Military Region, which did not have a very high position in the federal military, no longer cared about the questionable Battle 5460 and the bad impression that the military had of the 7th Mechanic Division. Based on the achievements of the Iron 7th Division, the 3rd Military Region did not hesitate to treat the 7th Mechanic Division as their trump card. Whether it was equipment or honor, the 7th Mechanic Division gave them everything they had. During these continuous maneuvers, the 7th Mechanic Division truly gained the reputation of the Iron 7th Division. Du Shaoqing also rose from a battalion commander to a regiment commander. Finally, at the age of 33, he became the youngest division commander in the history of the Federation. He even broke Li Pifu's record. No one had any doubts about this. Although the Iron 7th Division had never shown its sharp fangs at the front line of the West Woods to this day, and had never obtained any real military exploit. But when the Iron 7th Division was mentioned, the trump-card troops of the various military regions who had encountered the division in maneuvers would think of the Iron 7th Division in the mountains and on the mineral planets. It was as condensed as a fist, scattered like a gust of wind, roaring and howling. It was an iron-blooded division with a cold steel will in its strict and solemn demeanor. These trump-card troops were really frightened by the Iron 7th Division in many maneuvers. They absolutely believed that if a division like the Iron 7th Division was sent to the front line, it would be easy for them to achieve their own great military exploit. And Du Shaoqing, who had personally trained this kind of division, of course, he was qualified, and only he was qualified to be the commander of such a division. Su Lo held his empty wine glass and narrowed his eyes thoughtfully. He thought about how Du Shaoqing was able to turn a division that had been deliberately abandoned by the military into a well-disciplined and terrifyingly well-trained Iron 7th Division. He led this division to achieve such a fierce military exploit. He was really not an ordinary person. He could really be said to be extremely talented and had extraordinary perseverance. Or maybe he was just like Li Pifu, a peerless military genius. If he was remembered by such a person, it would not be very good news. When Lan Xiaolong was telling these stories, a few people were sitting around the table. The combat personnel of Iron 7th Division did not toast to Su Lo. Instead, they brought their lunchboxes to the table, which seemed to indicate some kind of attitude. Xiong Linquan frowned and looked at Su Lo. He suddenly said, "I know that the Iron 7th Division is very fierce, but Du Shaoqing is just one person. He wants to become the second army god?" He doesn't even know if the Empire will agree. If he really has the ability, he should take the initiative to go fight a few battles in the Westwood. Over the past year, the seniors of Iron 7th Division had heard a lot about Su Li's achievements from Bai Yulan. They found it hard to believe, but after seeing it with their own eyes in the training base, it had a certain impact on their minds. They knew very well that in the years to come, Su Lu would always be the supervisor of Iron 7th Division. They would be Su Li's men. Although they still could not say that they were very close to Su Lu right now, when they saw him worrying about the Iron 7th Division, they subconsciously mocked him a little. After all, in front of outsiders, they had always been on Su Li's side. The Iron 7th Division had been dazzling and imposing in the military all these years because of a series of achievements. However, they did not have a reputation in the Federation. It was precisely because of this that the Iron 7th Division's biggest problem was that they had never been to the front lines in the Westwoods. Therefore, Xiong Linquan's question was tantamount to directly asking a question about the Iron 7th Division's most vital part. The soldiers of the Federation valued honor above all else. The 5 officers of the Iron 7th Division, who had been silently eating in the distance, heard Xiong Linquan's question. A hint of anger flashed across their cold faces. One of the officers suddenly stood up and angrily rebuked Su Li's table. "My division commander has written a letter in blood requesting to fight 103 times. Who dares to say that my division doesn't dare to fight?" Hearing this powerful and resonant sentence, the people at Su Li's table fell silent. Xiong Linquan opened his mouth, but in the end, he did not retort. After all, this involved the most important issue of a division's reputation. Instead, it was Lan Xiaolong who said with a smile, "Don't tell me that the soldiers under Division Commander Du are all like your 2 colleagues who were carried away? From the looks of it, Division Commander Du is just SOSO. The officer who had stood up to debate for the Iron 7 Division had a frosty expression on his face as he said in a cold voice, "Division Commander Shaoqing graduated first from the 1st Affiliated High School of the capital 1st Affiliated High School, entered the 1st Military Academy first, and graduated first from the 1st Military Academy first. A member of the Federation's Trinity Association, the youngest division commander in the Federation. If this is all there is to it, then who can bring it out to compare?" This officer's voice was very cold, but there was a hint of fanaticism in it. The indifference was directed at Su Li's table, but the fanaticism showed the admiration and reverence that the Iron 7th Division officers had for this division commander. The best high school in the Federation was the Capital University Affiliated High School, and the most difficult school to get into was the 1st Military Academy. The Federation had a population of more than 10 billion, and these 2 most prestigious schools had gathered countless geniuses and elite. Previously, when this officer repeated Du Shaoqing's resume, this division commander had actually gotten first place 3 times in a row. According to the simple life before the catastrophe depicted in the movies, this kind of excellent result was equivalent to getting first place in the 3 examinations, which was extremely rare. The Trinity Association's history was exactly like this. Until today, there were only a dozen members of the Federation's Trinity Association, and most of them were already old men. It was no wonder that when this officer talked about his teacher, his back was ramrod straight and his face was full of pride. Hearing this, Su Li's table was shocked into silence, thinking that Du Shaoqing's resume was really a mess. Even Lan Xiaolong's lips curled into a cold smile, but he didn't say anything, because he really couldn't find a loophole to attack this impeccable division commander. Su Lu was also shocked, but what surprised him was the Iron 7th Division officers' fanatical reverence and worship for their division commander. Based on his rough understanding, he always felt that this kind of situation in the military wasn't a good thing. The Iron 7th Division officers' eyes were as cold as ice, but this kind of calm that was about to freeze represented their pride and glory. Although they didn't show any contempt or disdain, they made the people standing opposite them feel a sense of pressure and displeasure. Su Lo had drunk a lot tonight, so he was a little excited. Feeling the coldness and disdain of the Iron 7th Division officers, he shook his head and said, "I happen to know two people who are qualified to enter the Trinity Association. One of them is now a secretary, and the other one is in prison." He smiled, looked up at the officer, and said, "So this doesn't mean anything. I think your division commander doesn't want you to talk about his childhood every day." The officer's expression stiffened, and when he was about to say something, Su Lu said seriously, "If you don't believe me, you can ask around and see if I'm lying." The two people he was talking about were Secretary Shen Li and Shi Qinghai from the back mountain of Macho. One was the person in charge of the Tai family, and the other was the person who had manipulated the presidential election and assassinated Macklin. It was not a disgrace to do Shaoqing's status as a teacher. However, he only said that one was a secretary, and the other was in prison. This made the people of the Iron 7 Division very angry. The 5 Iron 7th Division officers realized that Instructor Su didn't seem to be lying. After a moment of silence, they saluted and left the busy cafeteria. Su Lu looked at the 5 officers, who didn't fit in with the surrounding environment, and couldn't help but frown. Lan Xiaolong asked, "Is what you said true?" Su Lu paused for a moment before he realized that he was asking about Secretary Shen and Mr. Shi. He smiled and said, "Of course it's true. I rarely lie." Chapter 331. There are many theories. Some say that the Iron 7th Division's performance is too strong. Coincidentally, the situation between the Federation and the Empire has been relatively calm in the past 10 years. If they were to use the 3rd Military Region's trump card division to fight in the West Woods, it would seem that they value the Empire too much. It was already late at night. The early autumn breeze blew on Su Li's hot cheeks, waking him up a little. After getting drunk in the cafeteria, Lan Xiaolong and Zhou Yu forcefully dragged him out and were now walking towards the instructor's apartment. Lan Xiaolong shrugged, but this habitual action almost made Su Lu vomit. He heard the major of the 83-84 mocking, "Trump card division?" The war god set the strategy of fighting in the West Woods years ago in order to maintain the combat effectiveness of the army in a relatively calm environment. The trump card divisions of the 4 military regions, the Iron Army, which one of them isn't yelling and rushing to the West Woods? Why don't I see the Department of Defense keeping them as a last resort? I don't agree with you. The Iron 7th Division's performance in the various military exercises is indeed too strong. When I was in school, the instructors once discussed this issue. The Federation believes that good steel should be used on warship rams. Iron-blooded troops like the Iron 7th Division have always been suppressing their pride and anger, not allowing them to be deployed, just so that they can be the vanguard of an expedition against the Empire in the future. Zhou Yu said. He had graduated from the 1st Military Academy, so the discussion of those professors and lecturers made some sense. Even if what you said makes sense, even though I don't like the Iron 7th Division, I still have to admit their combat effectiveness. Lan Xiaolong's expression was a little lonely. We don't know why the Federation didn't allow them to fight in the West Woods. Su Lu let out a drunken burp. He was too lazy to speak, but when he heard the words that entered his ears, he couldn't help but feel a bit curious. From the attitude of the officers in the training base, the soldiers of the Federation respected and distanced themselves from the Iron 7 Division. The feelings of admiration and discomfort were tangled together, but very few people were like Lan Xiaolong and Xiong Linquan earlier, directly expressing their dissatisfaction. Lan Xiaolong changed the topic and said mockingly, "Regarding the issue we discussed, there's always a rumor going around. Why the Federation didn't allow the Iron 7th Division to go to the West Woods? What rumor?" Commander Zhong of the West Woods Military District. Lan Xiaolong smiled mysteriously and said, "He used to be a classmate of Du Shaoqing, but I heard that Commander Zhong hated this person so much that he directly flipped out to the Ministry of Defense and firmly refused to allow the Iron 7th Division to fight in the West Woods." When Su Lu and Zhou Yu heard this for the first time, they couldn't help but be shocked. They thought to themselves, how could a great general of the Federation directly go against the orders of the Ministry of Defense just because of some personal feelings? But after thinking about it silently, it seemed that only this kind of seemingly unreliable rumor could explain why Du Shaoqing couldn't find any opportunity to set foot in the West Woods even though he had been outstanding for more than 10 years. The Zhong family of the West Woods was the only one of the 7 major families of the Federation that had military power. The current head of the family was Little Watermelon's father, Commander Zhong of the West Woods Military District. There were 4 major military academies and 4 major military districts in the Federation. However, when people talked about the 4th Military Academy and the 4th Military District in the West Woods, they were already used to calling them the West Woods Military District and the West Woods Military Academy. Commander Zhong controlled the military power of the West Woods region, and the Zhong family secretly controlled the politics and economy of the West Woods region. If it wasn't for the glory of the charter that spread throughout the universe, this big shot who seemed to have a corner of the universe was completely like a warlord. Probably only this kind of local tyrant could brazenly exclude Du Shaoqing from the West Woods for so many years. When Commander Zhong gets angry, the President can't do anything, and the Department of Defense can't do anything either. This is probably the biggest helplessness of Du Shaoqing's life. Lan Xiaolong said with slight sarcasm, but Du Shaoqing can be considered a stubborn person. With his ability to manage an army and command strategy, how could he only be promoted to Major General this year? For the past few years, the 3rd Military District has been trying to promote him and transfer him to the headquarters. Even the Joint Chiefs of Staff are interested in transferring him to the capital to train him well, but this person is determined not to agree. He just wants to stay in the position of commander of the Iron 7th Division. The drunk Su Lu listened to these words in a daze. He remembered some of it and forgot some of it. He just felt the alcohol rush to his head and fell asleep. After getting drunk, he fell into a dark and sweet dream. In his dream, he saw a lot of things. Shi Qinghai had been locked up for a lifetime. When he was released from prison, his hair was already silver, but he was still flirting with the female officer guarding him. Li Wei was holding a machete and looking at the crowd on both sides with a face full of fear. On one side of the crowd was the calm Lady Tai, and on the other side was the kind Madame Zhong. He didn't seem to know which side to walk to. Su Lu also dreamed of a head of purple hair, a pair of black-rimmed glasses, and a certain young genius girl with big breasts. In his dream, there was also a very faint beautiful face, but he couldn't remember who it was. He also dreamed of an old butler wearing a black suit. During his time in the black prison of Foxfort, he often saw this old butler. Although he could clearly recognize that the other party was the incarnation of some great existence in his dreams, he was already fearless. He walked over with a smile on his face. However, this old thing was somewhat abnormal today. His face was so solemn that it made one's heart palpitate. It seemed that in the next moment, he would turn into countless rays of white light that would envelop Su Li's body and slowly devour it like some single-celled organism, leaving not a single bone behind. Su Lu was very frightened in his dream because he knew that he didn't have many methods to resist the other party. However, he forcefully concealed his fear and forced a smile. He extended his non-existent hands to touch the old butler's wrinkled face. At this moment, the old butler's frosty face finally disappeared. He became like a mischievous child. Using his pair of eyes full of wisdom and absolute calmness, he showed Su Lu what the taste of a shrewd and ruthless craftiness was like. In the end, the old butler's face became as white as a sheet of paper, as white as a snowy mountain. However, he wore the military uniform of a major general. His figure was as straight as a cedar tree in the mountains, emitting a bone-piercing chill. Su-Lu woke up and quietly looked at the sky outside the window. He wasn't sure if this dream was auspicious or inauspicious. He didn't know if the central computer in the Bureau of Proclamations underground would always silently watch him like this. However, he knew very well what the officer who appeared in the end represented. It represented the big trouble he was about to encounter soon. That teacher named Du Shaoqing. However, he was fearless. After experiencing so many trials and storms, it would probably be difficult for even the most outstanding figure in the Federation to disturb his state of mind. After washing up, he began to call the relevant departments of the Federation government. He called Zhou Yu and that Madame Zhong. He was in the training base. He was worried about his two friends. Other than calling, it seemed like he couldn't do anything else. Time passed quickly as the radio waves flowed through the phone. In the blink of an eye, it was the day of the graduation ceremony at the training base. The Federation government attached great importance to the military officer training this time. In order to evaluate the results, they specially arranged a temporary military exercise. They transferred 3 fully mechanized divisions and handed them to the military officer students who were about to graduate. This allowed them to demonstrate their combat ability in all aspects. On this day, there were specks of yellow in the lush mountains behind them. With the feeling of autumn, they welcomed countless important figures and Federation soldiers who had come from afar. All kinds of military spaceships and planes arrived with a roar. Accompanied by a dense group of combat helicopters, they landed on a special airport. For a moment, military flags fluttered, military songs resonated, and the sound of footsteps rang out. Countless military officers from the departments directly under the Ministry of Defense and various military regions came to watch the ceremony. Su-Lu and the members of Team 7 stood in the shade to the side of the rostrum. Looking at the high-ranking military officers on the rostrum, they were surprised to see a lieutenant general and several major generals. The military exercise officially began. The holographic screen on the rostrum, with the help of the Bureau of Proclamation, accurately displayed the situation of the military exercise in the mountains and the field. The purpose of this military exercise was to show the results of the training, so the higher-ups of the federal military were not nervous. They even took advantage of the time when the military exercise was advancing to the designated area to receive all the military officers who participated in the training. Su-Lu was naturally among those who were received. What made Team 7 and the rest of the military officers extremely shocked was that the lieutenant general on the rostrum, who was also the deputy commander of the 1st Military Region, was incomparably friendly when he personally received Su-Lu. Even the major generals behind him were sincerely encouraging him with warm words. Su-Lu himself knew the reason, so he could naturally guard his heart and not show a trace of arrogance. In fact, he had nothing to be proud of. What made him vigilant was that except for Lieutenant General E, the other high-ranking military officers looked at him with admiration in their eyes. There was also a trace of extremely complicated and strange emotions. The military god left Philadelphia for the first time in order to enter the military prison of Qinqing to see this young man. This matter was not a secret among the higher-ups of the federal military, and the military officers on the rostrum were all very clear about this. They knew that Su-Lu was a person with a strong backer, but they also knew that there was some trouble between him and the Iron 7th Division. They were all very curious about what would happen when Su-Lu and teacher Du Shaoqing, who was as cold as ice, met at the graduation ceremony. Su-Lu received the order of commendation from the military officers and returned to the team under the shade of the trees. Lan Xiaolong, who had been standing behind him, said softly, "Du Shaoqing is here, but he has never liked to show his face in public. Today, he is mainly here to pick up his own soldiers. I will tell you when I recognize them. Sulu shook his head, put his hands behind his back, and quietly watched the situation on the holographic screen. His smiling face was extremely calm, but his heart began to become vigilant because he felt a pair of emotionless eyes looking at him. Behind the rostrum, a major general slowly retracted his gaze and stood indifferently with his hands behind his back. Stars shone on the shoulders of his well-ironed military uniform. This person wore a pair of black leather gloves and polished military boot. His posture was extremely tall and straight, and his standing posture did not deviate an inch. The details were impeccable. However, whether it was the stars on his shoulder or the reflection of his gloves and military boots, nothing could hide the brilliance of this person's body. This middle-aged general's eyebrows were like unsheathed swords, but they were slightly covered by the shadow of the standard military cap. His whole body exuded a sense of perseverance and calmness, not like an iceberg, but like a cedar tree on an iceberg. In this noisy drill ground there was a great sense of transcendence. Such a person was naturally Du Shaoqing. Chapter 332. Du Shaoqing, the youngest commander in the history of the Federation, the famous general of a generation who had infinite expectations placed on him by the military, stood meticulously in an inconspicuous corner of the rostrum, but he attracted the attention of most people. Since ancient times, all famous generals had fought bravely on the battlefield. Without mountains of bones, fireworks like death rays, and without actual battle achievements, who could be called a famous general? However, Du Shaoqing successfully overturned this rule. In the past 10 years, Du Shaoqing and his Iron 7 Division had never set foot on the front lines of the West Wood. However, in countless military exercises, Du Shaoqing and his Iron 7 Division had perfectly demonstrated their powerful combat ability and commanding wisdom, vividly displaying their unique and fierce characteristic. The strategic advisors of the federal military and the major military academies, on the other hand, highly praised his military command theories. They acknowledged that he was the first general in the military who could perfectly combine macro-strategic intentions with specific tactical deductions after the military god Li Bufu. Du Shaoqing, who had never failed in his military career, and whose art of commanding had been written into the teaching materials of the military academy, was certainly a famous general of a generation. Unfortunately, the biggest flaw of being a famous general was that he didn't have the opportunity to be stained with the blood of the people of the Imperium and the dust of the West Woods. This was definitely the biggest regret of Du Shaoqing's life, and also his goal. However, there was still a lot of time left for him. If the war between the Federation and the Imperium broke out again, the Iron 7 Division would have to be on the front lines one day. But right now, he could only wear the hat of a military genius and wear the title of a famous general, stay in the capital ring a little lonely and angry, and participate in these meaningless military exercises and graduation ceremonies. The coldness emitted by the well-ironed military uniform and shiny military boots was probably a true portrayal of this commander's inner feelings. Glancing at Du Shaoqing from the corner of his eyes, Su Li's eyes quickly blinked. Such a peerless figure was like a tiger locked in a laboratory, unable to roar and run in the forest. After a long period of depression, it was likely that he would become even more dangerous. At this time, Lan Xiaolong also saw Du Shaoqing on the stage. The veins on his forehead bulged and then disappeared. He said in a cold tone, "Do you know why this military genius is not willing to be promoted to the 3 military regions and not willing to go to the Ministry of National Defense? That's because he wants to lead the Iron 7th Division to the West Woods, or even to the Empire. He wants to be a commander and lead the Iron 7th Division to the West Woods, or even to the Empire. He wants to make a name for himself. Otherwise, everyone will flatter him and say that he's a famous general. The best place for the general to return to should be on a burning warship. Sulu looked at the Major General on the stage, who was like a cedar tree, and thought for a while. He then slowly said a Federation proverb, "It's not strange that he has this kind of stubbornness. That's because the god of war was fought by our division's commander. When this commander Du first joined the army, every step he took seemed to be following the steps of his old commander. He copied his old commander completely." Lan Xiaolong said coldly and mockingly, "In fact, a lot of people have already seen that Du Shaoqing wants to be the second god of war of the Federation. A soldier who didn't want to be a general wasn't a good soldier, and a general who didn't want to be a god of war probably wouldn't have a bright future." Sulu had heard too much about the achievements of the Iron 7 Division in the past few days. He knew that Du Shaoqing was a person with amazing talent and a strong will. If he hadn't been suppressed by the big shot of the Zhong family in the West Woods, he probably would have already made outstanding military achievements. It wouldn't be impossible for him to catch up with the old man in Philadelphia. Lan Xiaolong was silent for a while, and then suddenly said with a hint of sadness, "I was in the 17th Division when I joined the army. Back then, when the commander sealed up the marshal's uniform, the 17th Division accepted the military order to become a regular ground force and was transferred to the Hongdu Garrison District. The designation was changed to 8384. Before the designation was changed, the Federation held a joint military exercise. In fact, it was just to send off the 17th Division. During the exercise, all the brother units gave us face. At that time, our division was filled with sadness, so we didn't do much. Only the Iron 7 Division of the 3rd Military Region looked like they had taken an aphrodisiac when they saw our division. Their faces were dark, and they chased after us like ghosts." What happened in the end? It was the first time that Sulu knew about this. He turned around and asked in surprise. "Our division lost." Lan Xiaolong lowered his head slightly and said in a heavy tone, "The 17th Division has always been the first division of the Federation. It was an undefeated division that was personally created by the old man. Even in the territory of the Empire, it had never tasted defeat, let alone a mere military exercise. But in the last military exercise before the designation was changed, we lost. We lost to the Iron 7 Division of the 3rd Military Region. At that time, Du Shaoqing wasn't the commander of the Iron 7 Division. He was the military officer in charge of tactical deduction in his division." Lan Xiaolong raised his head and stared at Du Shaoqing and the officers of the Iron 7 Division in the distance with disgust. He said coldly, "In order to build up his reputation, he took advantage of the fact that our division's morale was still unstable to beat us at the 17th Division's farewell ceremony. After we were transferred to the Garrison Division, there was no way for us to win back. This Commander Du is really shameless to the extreme." Sulu was silent for a long time. The competition between the various divisions in the military had always been extremely cruel. If that military exercise was said to be a farewell ceremony for the 17th Division and a ceremony for the retirement of Army God Li Pifu, then Du Shaoqing and his Iron 7 Division actually won. On one hand, it showed the combat ability of the Iron 7 Division. On the other hand, it also showed how terrifyingly strong this Commander Du's desire for victory was. To be able to personally defeat the 17th Division that was trained by Army God Li Pifu was probably the thing that Du Shaoqing looked forward to the most. Although our division is a bit weak right now, no one will forget when this matter is mentioned. Lan Xiaolong looked coldly at the Major General on the stage and said, "One day, we will get back this face and avenge our teacher." At this time, Sulu finally understood why Lan Xiaolong always showed a very targeted disgust towards the Iron 7 Division and Commander Du Shaoqing. He was not like the other Federation officers who were respectful and distant, but also couldn't hide their admiration. The Iron 7 Division defeated the 17th Division, but I don't know if this commander can catch up to that old man in Philadelphia. he thought as he narrowed his eyes and looked at Du Shaoqing's tall and straight figure on the stage. While the two were quietly discussing, the military exercise codenamed Graduation Day had also entered a heated phase. The color blocks that represented different troops on the giant screen gradually spread across the barren hills in a gradual manner. The simulated environment of this military exercise was a small occupied administrative planet at the edge of Westwood, and the troops that would be playing the role of the Empire's army was a division of the Iron 7 Division that had been dispatched from the distant 3rd Military Region. Su Lu narrowed his eyes and looked at the situation map on the holographic screen and the real-time feedback of the military strength fluctuations. Naturally, he thought of the officers that he had spent a few months with. Today, these officers were randomly assigned to form a battlefield command headquarters and led their own troops to carry out the established tasks of the military exercise. They were originally outstanding military talents, and they had also received comprehensive training. Whether it was commanding or tactical courage when leading the attack, there was no problem. However, when he thought that their opponent was the Iron 7 Division, Su Lu was a little worried. After all, he was also one of the instructors, and he really hoped that they could produce a good result. However, the situation of the military exercise did not develop as he had hoped. Su Lu was not a professional officer, and he had not received any relevant education. However, judging from the data fed back from the light beam and the frosty faces of the generals of the Federation, he knew that the troops led by the graduates were not in an advantageous situation right now. The image of the mountain captured by the precision satellite appeared on the holographic screen after the data was restored. Su Lu narrowed his eyes and looked at the soldiers wearing dark-colored digital camouflage uniforms on the holographic screen. He was deeply shocked by the cold aura that the other party exuded. The soldiers hidden in the fortifications in the mountains, whether it was the mobile battalion piloting the M5 mechas or the low-altitude attack troops hidden in the forest, whether it was the deployment and transfer of troops or the attacks, all of them were exceptionally accurate. The army of thousands appeared on the holographic screen like a single person, accurately and perfectly executing every order. Was this the strength of the Iron 7 Division? What shocked Su Lu the most was that this iron-blooded army was like a single person, but its brain was not in the command center at this time. Instead, it was like a bystander looking at the holographic screen indifferently and did not issue any orders. He subconsciously looked at the rostrum. The generals on the rostrum were silent and cold. Compared to them, Commander Du Shaoqing, who always had a cold expression on his face, seemed to be more normal. The commander was not here, but the Iron 7 Division was still able to display such amazing combat power. How crazy and meticulous did their daily training and tactical deduction have to be? At this time, Su Lu noticed that an officer walked up to the rostrum. He walked behind Du Shaoqing and whispered a few words. Du Shaoqing nodded slightly with a cold expression. The lieutenant colonel smiled slightly, took out a pair of sunglasses, and handed it over respectfully. Seeing Du Shaoqing put on the sunglasses under the sun, it added a sense of coldness. Su Lu frowned deeply. Could that lieutenant colonel be Du Shaoqing's bodyguard? Su Lu knew that the bodyguard of the Minister of Defense was just a colonel, and Du Shaoqing was just a division commander. How dare he use a lieutenant colonel as his bodyguard? Too arrogant. He narrowed his eyes slightly and muttered to himself. However, he knew that the federal military felt guilty towards Du Shaoqing and the Iron 7 Division because of Commander Zhong's outburst in the West Woods and forced the Iron 7 Division to obtain military merit. Naturally, they would not pay attention to these details. On the rostrum, Du Shaoqing slowly took off his gloves and put them in his left hand. His right hand touched the lower beam of his sunglasses. The curves on his face seemed to have been carved by a knife. He still stood straight, displaying the bearing and demeanor of a professional soldier. I've been pretending to be cool in the training base for more than 2 months. I thought that I had grasped the essence of it, but after seeing it today, I realize that my level is still far from it. Looking at Du Shaoqing, the role model of a professional military officer, Su Lu couldn't help but feel endless emotions. However, for some reason, he felt a sense of discomfort, but he didn't know where this feeling came from. Right at this moment, a burst of rapid discussion came from the rostrum. On the screen, the two sides of the military exercise had already come into contact on the Eastern Front. The battle was about to start. The color blocks that represented the military strength began to disintegrate and collapse, especially at the hilly terrain on the side. Both sides placed their special mecha battalions there. The heavy alloy mechas crushed the green and yellow forest, fiercely clashing together. The battle was extremely intense. I'm definitely not talking about what Kobe did to Jordan during the All-Star game. Recommend a book. Don't treat transmigration as your job. I've read this book before. Good, it's been in my collection for a long time. A friend has also recommended it before. Good, today a girl on Q took the initiative to recommend this book by an author she doesn't know. The book number is 135-5106. I don't know the author. Chapter 333. Su Lu looked at Du Shaoqing and thought about how the other person seemed to have a natural cold and majestic aura as a professional military officer, compared to the awkwardness he felt when he drew mountains instead of hills. He couldn't help but sigh softly. Although his voice was low, it still fell into the ears of the members of Team 7 next to him. From the beginning of the military exercise, the members of Team 7 had been standing in a scattered manner. When they heard Su Li's sigh, including Major Lan Xiaolong, everyone's spirits were lifted. They nodded like they were pounding garlic. They thought to themselves, who couldn't tell that you were faking it when you were pretending to be cool in class? But the teacher on the stage wasn't pretending to be cool, he was really cool. If the military officers and students who were currently braving the rain of bullets in the mountains and commanding the troops in battle heard Su Li's sigh, they would definitely have the same opinion. After the military exercise finished, the two sides began to make contact with each other in the predetermined terrain. The situation became extremely intense. The high-ranking military officers and their attendants on the rostrum followed the path on the stage and walked underground. There was a large empty room underground. The mechanics of the Federation's General Assembly base installed and repaired 37 large light screens and related electronic equipment yesterday. They temporarily acted as the headquarters for the graduation military exercise. A faint light fell into the space of the headquarters. The images on the light screen constantly changed. The Federal Central Computer was directly connected through the network. Using its supercomputing power, it presented all the details of the military exercise in real time for the military officers who were watching the exercise. Looking at the fierce contact battle between the two sides on the light screen, the military officers and officers in the headquarters discussed animatedly. The staff officer of the 1st Military Region, who was in charge of the military exercise, was busy in front of his workbench. The underground space was filled with a serious and tense atmosphere. Su Lu, who was standing inconspicuously in the corner, narrowed his eyes as he observed all of this. However, a very strange thought appeared in his mind. The high-speed electric current and data flow in the terminal workbench in front of him was that old man's clone. However, what he saw now was only electronic equipment, and there was no trace of the old man in the tuxedo. When he was young, Su Lu had always wanted to participate in the mechanic officer examination of the Ministry of National Defense. For this, he had specially studied some tactical teaching materials of the federal military. However, he was not a professional soldier after all. Looking at the professional terms and terms that kept flashing on the 37 light screens, as well as the numerical curves that kept decreasing and increasing, He could not understand at all what stage the military exercise had progressed to. Lan Xiaolong glanced at his side profile and saw his awkwardness. He lowered his voice and explained a few words. Only then did Su Lu roughly understand the current development of the military exercise. The Iron 7th Division, which was playing the role of the Empire's army, had gained the upper hand in the military exercise. They forcibly seized a high ground in the area 192, 220, 345 and occupied a considerable advantage. During this process, although the military officers deduced the opponent's tactical intentions in advance, they couldn't stop the advance of the Iron 7th Division. They could only watch as a big hole was torn open on their side. The Iron 7th Division was an exceptionally strong force. They were used to winning, but they would never be blinded by victory. Instead, they would develop absolute confidence and courage. Such a terrifying force had never been on the battlefield in the West Wood. Under the long-term dissatisfaction and anger, the commander of the Iron 7th Division and the ordinary soldiers all had a flame in their heart. Every time they participated in the Federation's military exercise, they wanted to spew out this flame so that it wouldn't burn their organs. They treated every military exercise as a real battle. They wanted to make up for the regrets of the entire force with the difficulties of their brothers. They wanted to prove to the Federation that they were the strongest division in the Federation. They didn't deserve to be placed in the peaceful and lonely S3 galaxy. They should go to the West Woods and even go on an expedition to the Empire. In countless military exercises, the Iron 7th Division had always won an overwhelming victory in the end. It had to be said that this had something to do with the overall fighting spirit of this division. During the military exercise, the Iron 7 Division's attacks were exceptionally fierce, causing people's hearts to turn cold. They had defeated countless of their brothers' troops, and had also established an unquestionable prestige and respect for this division and Du Shaoqing. What was even more frightening and respectable was that the Iron 7th Division didn't only know how to be fierce and inflexible. This Iron Blood Division had strict tactical discipline, sharp command, and strong practical experience. Every regiment and battalion seemed to have their own thoughts. Under the premise of a big goal and strict military orders, they could also show an extremely flexible and adaptable ability. This ability could even be demonstrated in a class segment. Every component and segment of the Iron 7th Division was as cold as ice. They were like machines that didn't know fatigue and fear, but they were also very agile. Under the control of Division Du Shaoqing, they were like living steel monsters, giving people a feeling that they were unstoppable. Su Lu looked at the hologram worriedly as he listened to Lan Xiaolong's detailed explanation. He was very worried about the students in the mountain. Although the Iron 7th Division today was playing the role of the Empire's army, and logically speaking, the Military Exercise Command Center wouldn't let them win an overwhelming victory. Moreover, Du Shaoqing wasn't personally commanding, but looking at the current situation, he felt that something was wrong. Everyone in the Military Exercise Command Center probably had the same feeling. Although these professional officers had long been used to the invincibility of the Iron 7th Division in the military exercise, the other side today was an outstanding officer specially trained by the Federation to prepare for a fierce war with the Empire. In the end, it still ended up like this. The highest-ranking lieutenant general in the room, Deputy Commander E, had a gloomy expression. The generals and senior officers behind him also stopped talking and were silent. Occasionally, someone thought of something and subconsciously turned to look. Du Shaoqing was sitting in a chair in the corner of the command center, drinking a cup of coffee. He didn't take off his sunglasses, and his chin was slightly lowered. It seemed that he didn't care about the outcome of this military exercise at all. This was probably the temperament and confidence of an ever-victorious general. After a simple lunch at noon, the Military Exercise Command Center began to busy themselves with work again. But at this time, Lieutenant General Yi's expression was much better than it was in the morning, and the atmosphere in the command center gradually relaxed. The reason for this change was that the situation of the military exercise shown on the 37 circular holograms was developing in a direction that comforted the federal military. In the face of the Iron 7 Division's ferocious and cold offensive, although the joint column under the command of the military officers was in an extremely difficult situation, after paying an extremely heavy price, they finally stopped the enemy in the area of the Lonely Mountain Range. Lonely Mountain was the code name of the military exercise simulation sand table on the graduation day. In fact, it was an area of mountains and valleys 70 kilometers behind the base. Both sides of the military exercise had to achieve their respective tactical objectives, so this area was of utmost importance. According to Su Li's understanding, the Military Exercise Command Center named this area Lonely Mountain because in the border area of the West Woods, on a planet that was first occupied by the Imperial Expeditionary Force, there was a lonely mountain. The military officers were divided into several small groups to command the joint column of the military exercise side. After all, they were the best all-around talents in the Federation. After being caught off guard by the ferocious offensive of the Iron 7th Division in the beginning, they gradually calmed down and fully displayed their excellent commanding skills. However, the cooperation between the various groups was still a bit stiff and rusty. Any small detail on the battlefield could affect the final outcome of a battle. The reason why the joint forces were able to hold off Iron 7 Division at Lonely Ridge was because the Special Mecha Battalion of the Joint Forces had taken the risk of cutting in from a 30-degree angle. The Special Mecha Battalion, which had 8 MX mechas, had successfully evaded the electronic surveillance and destroyed the reserve armored force camp that Iron 7 Division had purposely left there in one fell swoop. The heavy black silhouettes of the alloy mechas were like silent giants. With agility that did not match their bodies, they quickly advanced on the rugged mountain path, splitting up and launching surprise attacks. The generals in the Military Exercise Command Center watched the screen and couldn't help but gasp in amazement. This was the first time the Federation's new MX mecha had displayed its true power in a large-scale battle. It completely overturned everyone's previous impression of mecha being cumbersome and powerful, and achieved very clear result. The Black MX mecha leading the charge of the Special Mecha Battalion's tactical movements were extremely precise and fierce. Su Lu narrowed his eyes as he watched the mecha's movements. He immediately determined that the pilot inside was definitely Hua Xiaoxi. He had taught them for more than 2 months and was so familiar with the mecha movements of these officers that he could replay them in his mind. Naturally, he could tell who the pilot was through certain movement habits and details. Hua Xiaoxi was the joint first in the mecha assessment, so he naturally had to assume the role of the main attacker of the mecha battalion. 8 MX mecha meant that 8 officers were not in the command center of their respective unit. Instead, they were charging on the front lines of the battlefield. He had watched for a long time before discovering that Zhou Yu was not among these 8 MX mecha. After thinking about it for a while, he understood. Although Zhou Yu was very good at mecha piloting, at the same time, he was also the number 1 in the tactical deduction test. He was only slightly worse than Yuan. For this military exercise, he must have stayed in the command center of the joint column to be in charge of commanding the entire column. Thinking about how Zhou Yu was currently commanding the joint column to block the cold and terrifying attack of the Iron 7th Division at Silent Hill, and then thinking about how the MX mecha that was incomparably close to him would definitely shine brightly in this military exercise, Su Lu was like a rock. He couldn't help but feel a sliver of pride. Unfortunately, he would not be able to learn the ability to command troops from this military exercise. Every profession has its own specialization, Su Lu thought to himself somewhat self-deprecatingly. If he had been the commander on the battlefield, Any one of these officer cadets whom he had scolded for so long would have been able to annihilate the troops he was leading. This was the difference between them. Thinking of this, he suddenly thought of that teacher who had not personally commanded today. Glancing over from the corner of his eye, he saw Du Shaoqing sitting solemnly in his chair, his expression as cold as ice. But for some reason, Su Lu felt that there was an invisible curve at the corner of the other's lips, expressing some sort of disdain and contempt. The graduation drill used a real simulated battlefield, using a 17% ratio. The relevant battle scale, firepower calculation, and time were all calculated according to this ratio, representing 1/6 of the real battlefield environment. When it was close to evening, the graduation drill officially ended. A total of 5 tactical objectives had been set for this military exercise. Under the brilliant display of the MX mecha and the precise and calm command of the officer cadets, the combined column had made a strong counterattack in the latter half of the drill. In the end, they had completed 2 of the objectives with the help of the attack group at the last moment. And the Iron 7th Division, which had gone into battle in a conventional manner, was as strong as ever. This iron-blooded troop completely ignored the unexpected blow they had received in the latter half of the drill, silently and even somewhat calmly completing 3 of the tactical objectives. The calmness of the Iron 7th Division was particularly evident during the process of the troops returning to camp after the drill. The screen in the command hall was clearly broadcasting the scene over there. From the senior officers of the Iron 7th Division to the most basic gunner, the expressions on their faces were calm, cold, and proud. This kind of pride seemed to be forever on their faces. This kind of calmness seemed to be something they would never forget. A troop that was used to winning was indeed very frightening, just like their teacher. The people in the Military Exercise Command Center were already quite satisfied with this result, and traces of a smile appeared on Lieutenant General Yi's face. The federal military had long been used to the victories of the Iron 7th Division. Today, the combined column under the command of the officer cadets had not lost too badly. Although the defensive line would definitely have collapsed if they had held on for a standard day, this was still the most evenly matched military exercise in many years. These officers that the Federation had focused on grooming did not lose face for the military. After the military exercise ended, the various participating troops left the base one by one. Su Lu looked at the military transport ships that covered the sky and couldn't help but feel a little puzzled. It was said that the Federation was lacking in crystal resources, but for the sake of a military exercise, they were able to transport thousands of people from S2. It seemed that in order to prepare for war with the Empire, the Federation really was willing to pay any price. Immediately after, he turned his head and looked at the officers lined up in front of him. He narrowed his eyes and smiled slightly. At this time, the instructors were all standing on the other side. He was only the instructor of the mecha class, so it was naturally not convenient for him to stand out and say anything. However, his mood was revealed through his expression. Although he was young, these officers in front of him were still considered his students. This was probably a sense of achievement that came from being a teacher. The officers did not try to hide the smiles on their faces. Although they were all proud people, they had enough reason to be proud of the fact that they were able to fight so well against the Iron 7th Division after forming a team at the last minute and commanding troops they were not familiar with. Zhou Yu and Hua Xiaoxi were the focal figures among the officers because in this military exercise, Zhou Yu had been responsible for the overall tactical deduction, while Hua Xiaoxi had been responsible for the most dangerous ambush. The two of them had contributed the most. Hua Xiaoxi's eyebrows were raised in unspeakable joy. Zhou Yu, on the other hand, maintained his gentlemanly appearance, smiling in response. Right at this time, the slightly chaotic ranks suddenly quietened down, because the general in charge of inspecting and summarizing had already walked over. What was completely unexpected was that the person who had walked over was actually the commander of the Iron 7th Division, Du Shaoqing. The field instantly fell silent. The officers straightened their chests, the emotions in their eyes burning. If they could be praised by Du Shaoqing, it would be an irresistible honor for any officer. The monotonous sound of footsteps rang out. Du Shaoqing, wearing sunglasses, walked over with a cold expression. 3 officers from the Iron 7th Division followed behind him. When he reached the right side, the 3 officers stopped in their tracks. Du Shaoqing did not stop. His shiny military boots stepped slowly on the ground, as if landing on the hearts of the officers. He walked from the left to the right of the formation, then stopped. He looked coldly at the officers, his thin lips slightly parted, and his words were as sharp as knives. Known as the most outstanding officer in the Federation, after 8 months of training, all you end up with is a bunch of trash? Chapter 334. Everyone was still silent, but some of the officers' faces were slightly red, and a hint of struggle flashed through their eyes. They felt a strong sense of humiliation and anger, but no one dared to say anything. This was because they were in the military camp, and the person who had said those words was a major general, and the person who was rudely reprimanding them was Du Shaoqing. The lines of this young military general's face were very clear, just like the tactics he used to command the Iron 7th Division. Through the lenses of his sunglasses, one could faintly see his extremely deep eye sockets, just like the strict military discipline of the troops he led, deep and inviolable. The soldiers of the Iron 7th Division were proud and indifferent, and as a division commander, Du Shaoqing brought this temperament to the extreme. Coupled with his well-ironed general's uniform, his appearance and posture left a deep impression in people's minds. He had an exceptionally iron-blooded charm. No one in the federal military dared to deny this charm. In formal situations, no one had ever seen Du Shaoqing smile. Only the coldest and most ruthless people, who treated others and themselves to the extreme, could single-handedly train a troop like the Iron 7th Division. But many people knew that in private, Division Commander Du's favorite thing to do was to play the violin on the balcony of the barrack. The military camp was a place where the hierarchy was particularly strict. As a division commander, Du Shaoqing, no matter what he said or did, these officers who were much lower in rank than him could only listen obediently. Even if they were not convinced, they could only blush and straighten their backs even more. No one dared to voice out their doubts. The Federation government now particularly appreciated the Iron 7th Division, and the military also relied heavily on Du Shaoqing. After today's military exercise, he was the one who gave the speech, which already showed a certain inclination. Today, when war was about to begin, a sharp and cold military knife like Du Shaoqing could not be hidden in its scabbard forever. Even if the fierce man from the Zhong family in the West Woods tried to suppress him, he would not be able to hold down the handle of the knife. The strict discipline and silence displayed by the trainees at this time could not melt the ice on Du Shaoqing's face. His sharp eyes slowly scanned the surroundings through the lenses of his sunglasses and coldly said, "For a preset military exercise like this, regardless of the outcome, it has no meaning to the Federation soldiers." With one sentence, he had made the graduation speech organized by the Federal Military Japanese Army a piece of sh*t. Probably only this major general, who had thousands of eyes on him, dared to say such words. However, his words also erased the most awe-inspiring capital of the Iron 7th Division in one stroke. When others heard it, they could not refute it at all. Du Shaoqing quietly looked at the officers in front of him. Only he knew that these words were from his heart. The stage of a soldier could only be the real battlefield. Even if the Iron 7th Division, led by him, could always maintain the victory of the military exercise in the next 100 years, what was the point? If he could not set foot in the West Woods, defeat the imperial armies, and make a real contribution, his title as a famous general was only a famous general on paper. He could not even beat the fierce tiger from the West Woods, whose surname was Zhong, let alone catch up with the old man from Lake Feiqing. Thinking of this, Du Shaoqing's expression became even colder. The lines on his jawline were abnormally stiff. He coldly reprimanded, "The Federation has only successfully assembled 27 MXs. This time, we transferred 8 MXs to you. You actually fought like this. As soldiers of the Federation, don't you feel ashamed?" Du Shaoqing did not seem to be satisfied. He coldly looked at the crowd and calmly said, "After fighting with the 7th Division and seizing 2 tactical targets, do you feel very satisfied? Before the battle, you are already thinking about losing. As soldiers of the Federation, don't you feel ashamed? Even these 2 targets were given to you by my subordinate." Du Shaoqing reprimanded in a deep voice, "I don't want to give you any face. I also don't care about the Military Exercise Command Center's plan. The sand table is the battlefield. Today, the 7th Division didn't let you lose too badly. It has nothing to do with you. I was just thinking about those normal soldiers who were carelessly commanded by you. As a military officer, I don't want to see the soldiers at the bottom lose all hope in the future command system of the Federation military. Fighting a fake battle, yet you still need the opponent to deliberately show mercy. As soldiers of the Federation, don't you feel that you are trash? Ashamed, ashamed trash." Each sentence was sharper and heavier than the last, especially what Du Shaoqing said at the end. Today, the joint column under the command of the military officer had taken 2 tactical targets, and it was actually the Iron 7th Division that deliberately let them win. The military officer cadets clearly knew that at the beginning of the military exercise, they found a lot of objective difficulties for themselves. They did not have the courage to try and defeat the Iron 7th Division. After being pointed out by Commander Du, they no longer felt as proud as before. Instead, they felt a little ashamed. But when they heard the last sentence, they felt very indignant. This was the result of the battle that they fought for. How did it become the Iron 7th Division letting them win? The military officers stood even straighter. It was as if there was fire in their eyes. But under the strict military discipline, still no one dared to stand out. You know how to be angry, it means that you still have a sense of shame. You are not considered trash that can't be saved. Although you are not far from being useless. Du Shaoqing looked at everyone coldly. His hands that were holding the black leather gloves were behind his back. He said lightly, "Zhou Yu, step forward." Zhou Yu was slightly shocked. He took a step forward from the formation and stood at attention. He looked straight ahead and saluted. His movement was extremely clean and neat. He was a gentle gentleman. Facing this cold and dignified Major General, he could not help but be extra cautious. He wanted to make sure that the other side would not be able to find any mistakes in the details. The second tactical deduction from the anti-terrorism drill? Du Shaoqing had not walked past him before, so he casually glanced at him. "Yes, General." Zhou Yu answered loudly with an expressionless face. "The second tactical deduction," Du Shaoqing said indifferently, "let me ask you, if the 7th Division gave up on the backup and didn't provide any support when your mecha battalion went straight to the bottom of Silent Hill and attacked your camp with the armored brigade, what would you do?" The atmosphere in the middle of the silent field suddenly changed. This was because all the military officers, including the instructors standing outside, could hear that this division commander Du Shaoqing, who was known for his tactical deduction, was actually going to verbally test the military officers' brains today. He wanted to use this to prove to everyone that the 7th Division had gone easy on them today. This was to give these military officers a heavy blow to their confidence. Zhou Yu, on the other hand, was not afraid at all. His eyes suddenly lit up and he replied in a clear voice, The instructor said that the MX mecha is best at surprise attacks and decapitation. Our army will need 34 minutes to rush down to provide assistance, and 12 minutes to return to the camp. Within 46 minutes, the 7th Division's armored brigade will not be able to pass through Area 452. 124. Why not? Du Shaoqing looked at him coldly. Because the road is not easy to travel, General. It was rare for Zhou Yu to be so playful. It seemed that even someone as gentle and polite as him felt a bit of disgust towards the aggressive Du Shaoqing. When he heard Zhou Yu mention the instructor, Su Lu was smiling with his head lowered. Hearing this, his smile widened. Du Shaoqing was not affected. He was not angry, but he did not laugh. He asked coldly, "Why is it not easy to travel?" Zhou Yu was slightly taken aback. He replied, "The area is all mountainous. The armored brigade is not suitable to advance quickly in this kind of terrain. Also, the 7th Division's commander should have considered that it is easy to be attacked by individual weapons in this kind of terrain. The casualty rate is too high. There is no need to consider casualty rates in war," Du Shaoqing said coldly. To the side of Area 452. 124, there is a temporary road used by the main assembly base for maintenance of the radar station. Although it has been out of use for 20 years, the armored brigade can still force its way through without any problem. As soon as these words were said, the originally silent scene was instantly filled with gasps. Who would have thought that Du Shaoqing would actually know of a maintenance road that had been out of use for 20 years? Perhaps even the logistics officer of the base would not be able to describe the location of this road so casually. Zhou Yu's eyes narrowed. He felt a trace of nervousness and disbelief. His brow furrowed, and after a moment of silence he said, "The map provided by the Exercise Command Center did not indicate this road." "You officers have been in this base for 8 months, Du Shaoqing reprimanded in a low voice. The 7th Division only received the order for the exercise 3 days ago. The 7th Division came from System S3. They only used 3 days to find this abandoned road, but you guys don't know about it. Is this an excuse?" Zhou Yu frowned and thought for a long time. He confirmed that if the 7th Division's armored brigade had been able to use this road, the situation of today's military exercise would have been greatly reversed. But who would have thought that the people of the Iron 7th Division would actually know the terrain of the military exercise area better than they did? Preparation for the battlefield was indeed the most important thing. Could it be that the other side had really gone easy on them today, and that was why the troops under his command were able to get a barely passable result? Thinking of this, Zhou Yu's brow furrowed even tighter. He said very seriously, "Even if the armored brigade was able to use this road that we don't know about, how could they have discovered the location of the Joint Army's camp? I've already set up 3 layers of electronic interference barriers beforehand, and the satellite signal filtering and disguising has also been completed." He raised his head to look at Du Shaoqing's cold profile and said, "And the armored brigade's disguise radius is not large. After I discovered them, the MX mecha that had returned to help would have been able to coordinate with the heavy infantry to disperse them before they could reach me. Why couldn't they have discovered your camp? Forget about the things you learned in No. 1 Academy." Du Shaoqing said coldly, "Those electronic barriers of yours are as densely packed as an old woman's underwear. I don't know if it's because you're afraid of the cold or because you're afraid of exposing your body, but you actually set up so many layers. There's a very simple principle on the battlefield. It's just like being a person, the thing that you want to protect the most is the most vulnerable and most important part of your enemy." A thick sense of mockery flashed across his face that was not covered by the sunglasses. Any civilian equipment would have been able to discover the strangeness of your area. Even if they didn't know what you were hiding, they would still know that it was your weak point. Cold sweat gradually seeped out of Zhou Yu's back. He suddenly raised his head and retorted, "You're gambling with the armored brigade's life. If I deliberately used 3 layers of electronic barriers as a disguise to lure the armored brigade into the ambush," Du Shaoqing unhappily waved his hand and cut him off. He said coldly, "All of your soldiers are tied up at the eastern line of Silent Hill. How would you have extra soldiers to set up an ambush? Even if the armored brigade didn't find your camp, once they came out from there, they would be able to circle around your camp and coordinate with the main force of the 7th Division. How many people do you think will be able to survive today? The most important thing is..." Du Shaoqing looked at Zhou Yu indifferently. He increased his tone and said with a pressuring tone, "Your camp is right there. A soldier must dare to gamble on the battlefield. A soldier who doesn't have the will to gamble is destined to be a failure." Zhou Yu slowly lowered his head. He furrowed his eyebrows and thought for a long time. Then, he raised his head firmly and said, "Even if the armored brigade comes, I can still use the 44-man assault formation to retreat. As long as I can hold on until the mecha camp comes back, this battle can still be fought." 120-447 area. How much power do you have left? One of the 7th Division's divisions is watching over there, Du Shaoqing said coldly without hesitation. Zhou Yu thought for a while and replied, "But 120-446 area is still in my hands. The highest altitude here is 1,245 meters. Your assault helicopters won't be able to do much damage." Du Shaoqing said expressionlessly, "Your MX is on the way back. Although the 7th Division's M52 is a little slow, it's not like they can't walk on the mountain road." Zhou Yu was stunned. He frowned and thought for a long time. There was no terminal computer, no holographic screen, no map coordinates, no firepower deployment data, and no modern tools. The most talented division commander in the Federation and the best tactical deduction expert in the new generation of military officers were just using his memory and understanding of the troops on the battlefield to make verbal deductions. The field grew quieter and quieter. Only the voices of these 2 people could be heard. It was as if there were golden spears and armored horses colliding in the air, making crisp and silent sounds of collisions. There was also the faint smell of smoke from the explosions of gunpowder. However, Division Commander Du Shaoqing's tone was always cold and indifferent. Moreover, he didn't need time to think before making any deployment. Zhou Yu, on the other hand, took longer and longer to think, and his voice became more and more labored. The federal military recognized Du Shaoqing as the #1 person in terms of strategic intelligence and tactical command. For Zhou Yu to be able to argue verbally with him was already very impressive in the eyes of everyone present. However, looking at the cold-faced division commander wearing sunglasses, everyone felt an incomparable chill in their hearts. They wondered what exactly Du Shaoqing's brain was made of. The few lieutenant colonels of the Iron 7th Division who came with Du Shaoqing had calm expressions. They had seen too much of their division commander's shocking military intelligence and had long gotten used to all of this. On the contrary, they instead felt a faint admiration for Zhou Yu, who had been verbally deducing tactics with his division commander until now. Back when he was at the West Woods Preparatory Military Academy, Zhou Yu was already regarded as a genius, completely overshadowing his already excellent brother Zhou Jin. He was sent by the 4th Military Region to the 1st Military Academy to study history and battle examples. He was incomparably diligent, and that was why he had achieved what he had today. However, what made him feel incomparably oppressed was that the division commander he was facing today, Du Shaoqing, was actually as cold and unapproachable as a snowy mountain. Every virtual command that came out of this person's thin lips was like a noose that tied people to death, making it difficult for him to breathe, and cold sweat trickled down his back. What made him even more fearful was that Du Shaoqing's tactical commands were not only sharp and forceful, they were also meticulous in taking care of the details. There was not the slightest gap, and his calculations were extremely precise. It made people feel a sense of defeat, and they actually gradually lost all of their confidence. The joint column will definitely lose. I admit that the Iron 7th Division showed mercy today. After a long silence, Zhou Yu reluctantly admitted defeat and gave a military salute. "Return to your unit," Du Shaoqing said coldly, but the eyes hidden behind the sunglasses flashed with a hint of surprise. He had not expected that there would actually be a talent in this batch of officers. In just a split second, he had the thought of transferring Zhou Yu to the 7th Division. He glanced coldly at Zhou Yu, who had already returned to his unit, and suddenly remembered that this young officer seemed to be someone from the Tai family. Teacher Du Shaoqing had always been cold and self-controlled, but he was also a person with great ambition and ambition. A successful general needed countless outstanding subordinates, and without question, Zhou Yu had this potential. He believed that he was a tolerant person, and also believed that the melting pot known as the Iron 7th Division would definitely be able to attract truly outstanding professional soldiers. It was because of this innate calm and self-confidence that even though he had clearly thought of Zhou Yu's background, he was only slightly taken aback, and did not have the slightest hesitation in his desire to take this person into the Iron 7th Division. Tolerant was only tolerant of those who were willing to be accommodated. Towards those who were unwilling to be accommodated, Teacher Du Shaoqing had always been as cold as winter. His blade-like gaze swept past Su Lu through his sunglasses, and then he quickly retracted it. "If you know that you are trash, then there is still room for improvement." Du Shaoqing looked at the extremely ugly expressions of the officer students, and said coldly. Just as the entire field was deathly silent, preparing for Teacher Du's storm-like reprimand, an extremely untimely voice suddenly rang out. "Spending so much effort to win against a piece of trash who just graduated from school, it's really meaningless." As these words were spoken, the entire field fell silent, and a chilling sense of danger arose spontaneously. The military camp was strictly governed by military hierarchy. When a major general was lecturing, who would allow a subordinate to casually interrupt? Earlier, the officer students had been thoroughly reprimanded, their faces flushed red, but they could only puff out their chests. Now, someone had actually appeared out of nowhere and said such a thing. If this wasn't courting death, then what was? Moreover, these words were clearly directed at Du Shaoqing and his 7th Division. Previously, Teacher Du had said that the military exercise of the Federation was meaningless, so this person had said that Du Shaoqing's victory over Zhou Yu was just an armchair strategist. What was even more frightening was the hidden meaning in this person's words. Teacher Du had coldly and harshly condemned this group of officer students as trash. "Then you worked so hard to win against a trash, what was that?" These words were not spoken by Su Lu. The military camp was a place filled with the smell of iron and blood. The reprimands of superiors were all loud, and there were many people who scolded even more harshly than Du Shaoqing. There were all sorts of obscenities. Speaking of which, when Su Lu had been an instructor, he had also often scolded people as trash in class, but people were just so strange. Su Lu always viewed these officer students as his own students and scolded them himself. Hearing Du Shaoqing's incomparably cold reprimand, he felt exceptionally uncomfortable in his heart. However, he knew of the problem between himself and the Iron 7th Division, especially after feeling Du Shaoqing's cold gaze sweep over him twice earlier. Although he wanted to protect his calf, under the difference of military ranks, he could not do so. He could only remain silent. But Major Lan Xiaolong, who stood behind him, could not hold back the hint of dissatisfaction and mockery in his heart. After his slightly mocking voice rang out, The entire field instantly fell into an even more absolute silence than before. The 3 officers of the Iron 7th Division, standing on the left side of the formation, suddenly turned around and looked in the direction of the voice. These 3 officers had been silent the entire time. Their military posture was perfect. Even after standing for such a long time, their eyebrows didn't even twitch. They looked like 3 ice sculptures that were cold and indifferent, keeping people thousands of miles away. But at this time, these 3 officers were like fierce tigers that had suddenly awakened. 3 pairs of blade-like eyes stared at Lan Xiaolong's face at the same time. Du Shaoqing's sword-like eyebrows raised slightly. He slowly turned his head and also looked in that direction. There was no way the military camp would allow this kind of insubordination to happen. Lan Xiaolong had been stationed here for a long time, in Garrison Unit 8384, and had endured until he became a major. However, he had more or less an undisciplined aura, just like the members of the 7th Combat Group behind Su Lo and Su Lo. Even when the 3 officers of the Iron 7th Division glared at him with angry eyes, Lan Xiaolong still had an indifferent expression on his face. He even raised his eyebrows. But when Division Commander Du Shaoqing also turned his head, he couldn't help but feel a chill in his heart. He was a little confused. This division commander was clearly wearing sunglasses, but why did he feel like his gloomy gaze was about to pierce into his heart? One of the 3 officers of the Iron 7th Division was the guard officer Du Shaoqing, Shimin Jin, who had previously made Su Lu exclaim at Du Shaoqing's arrogance. As a lieutenant colonel, he was willing to serve as Du Shaoqing's guard officer. Naturally, he was incomparably loyal. Shimin Jin strode in front of Lan Xiaolong. His face was so gloomy that it seemed like rain was about to fall. He moved a few centimeters in front of Lan Xiaolong and scolded him loudly. "Which division are you from? Don't you know the rules? Who allowed you to interrupt when your superior is scolding you? Where are the military regulations that you learned? Tell me your name." Lan Xiaolong's ears were about to be deafened. Feeling the spittle on his face, he was a little displeased. However, he was suppressed by the other party's ferocious roar and anger. He looked at the gloomy face in front of him, and believed that if Du Shaoqing wanted to kill him right now, this guard officer would definitely pull out his gun and shoot him without hesitation. In order to maintain military discipline, Commander Du Shaoqing naturally wouldn't execute Lan Xiaolong for his actions. However, he would definitely make him suffer a lot. He might even be locked up in a dark room for half a month. However, Lan Xiaolong didn't regret this. As a member of the 17 Mechanics Division, how happy was it to be able to mock Du Shaoqing to his face. Furthermore, although his temperament was undisciplined, he still had the perseverance of the Federation soldiers. He looked at Shimin Jin indifferently and didn't say a word, waiting to be punished later. At this moment, there was a slight movement behind him. He was pulled behind someone. He looked over in shock and found that it was Su Lu who had protected him in front of him. It was like an old hen protecting her child. "He's Major Lan Xiaolong, a member of the Whitewater Company's 7th Combat Team," Su Lu explained to the guard officer in front of him. He had a headache about the trouble Lan Xiaolong had caused. The members of the Iron 7th Division had been looking for a chance to vent their anger on him. If he stepped in, wouldn't he be giving the other party the best reason? However, the members of the 7th Division were all orphans without a mother. With a wave of his hand, the old man in Philadelphia removed them from their official military status and put them under Su Li's command. As the supervisor, he had to step in at this moment. "Since you're not a training officer, why are you here now?" Shimin Jin looked at Su Lu and continued to scold him loudly. His expression was dark. Su Lu replied sincerely, "This is an order from the Ministry of Defense. I don't understand what's going on either." Shimin Jin frowned and said coldly, "He's your subordinate? Who are you?" Base Mecha Instructor Su Lu, currently the supervisor of the Whitewater Company's 7th Combat Team. Shimin Jin's expression was dark and he said disdainfully, as expected, the kind of instructor produces the kind of students. The kind of supervisor produces the kind of cowardly soldiers. Hearing these words, Su Li's eyebrows twitched slightly. The two small flying knives seemed to have the thought of flying. Shortly after, he took a light breath and said seriously, "It's not up to you to judge whether my soldiers are cowards or not. I may not be a good supervisor or a good instructor, but I think the students participating in today's military exercise are all not bad." Hearing these words, the expressions of the students standing in a row, who had initially been somewhat ugly, softened slightly. They all thought in their hearts that Instructor Xiao Su was usually a jerk, but in front of outsiders, he actually gave them face. However, they did not expect that this thought had already placed them in the same category as Su Lu. They had even copied Su Li's way of calling himself young master in class. As for the combat personnel of the 7th Combat Team, most of them were from the 17th Mechanic Division. They had an irreconcilable enmity with Du Shaoqing's Iron 7th Division. Hearing Su Li's words made them very happy. Furthermore, they were originally non-military personnel, so they had less to worry about. Xiong Linquan purposely made himself not look at that ice-cold instructor Du Shaoqing and said faintly, "Our soldiers are indeed quite cowardly. It's just that we often go to the West Woods to kill the Empire's people." Xiong Linquan's words were undoubtedly a loud slap to the face of the Iron 7th Division's officer. The stern look in Shimin Jin's eyes gradually deepened. He stared at Su Lu in front of him and said coldly, "You really have guts. You're a lieutenant colonel, and I'm also a lieutenant colonel. Why should I act pitiful and resentful in front of you?" From the moment the 7th Division appeared in front of him, Su Lu instinctively felt a sense of danger. Du Shaoqing had reprimanded everyone mercilessly, and his anger had already accumulated to a certain extent. At this moment, looking at the gloomy face of the guard in front of him and hearing his words, the two throwing knives on his forehead finally flew up. He replied indifferently. Shimin Jin was slightly stunned. He did not argue with him about the military rank. Instead, he looked at Lan Xiaolong, who was behind Su Lu, and said coldly, "You violated the rules. Have your man come out." In the military camp, this request was not unreasonable. However, Su Lu was not a professional soldier, and his personality also determined that he would not hand Lan Xiaolong over today. However, in the face of strict military discipline, what could he do? Earlier, when Teacher Du and Student Zhou Yu were conducting tactical simulations, this subordinate of mine only wanted to participate in the discussion. He did not intentionally interrupt the senior officer's conversation. I don't think he needs to be disciplined. Su Lu narrowed his eyes and actually said such a thing. You guys are from the 17th Division? Right at this moment, Du Shaoqing's cold and oppressive question came from the other end of the line. I was a little high on writing and actually wrote 7,000 words in one go. I forgot the time. Sorry. I don't know how to fight. Su Lu learned from Teacher Du's experience of pretending. Tomorrow, he'll show it a little. Chapter 335. Hearing his teacher's words, Lieutenant Colonel Shimin Jin's expression turned solemn. He quickly put away his angry and dark expression and calmly turned away, exposing Su Li's body to everyone's eyes. Su Li's heart chilled slightly. This guard's change in expression so quickly could only mean that his previous roaring and anger had all been an act. The Iron 7th Division was just looking for a reason to deal with him. Su Lu himself was a youth who occasionally got angry, so when faced with Shimin Jin or even Du Shaoqing's anger, he would not be afraid. However, today's opponent was a general whose rank and authority were far above his, and who had always maintained a calm mind and a cold hostility. This matter was somewhat troublesome. Lieutenant Colonel Su, as an instructor, Do you have your own opinion on the tactical deduction for this military exercise? Du Shaoqing said coldly. His speed was normal, and even his tone was normal. Just by pointing out Su Li's rank, he naturally had the air of a military camp. Su Lu had thought that this iron-blooded teacher would come to find trouble with him, but he did not expect the other's first words to be like this. Hearing the calmness and self-restraint in Du Shaoqing's words, as well as a natural sense of majesty, he silently thought that some of the truly important people in this world were probably used to their words, and no one dared to refute them. Therefore, there was naturally some kind of unquestionable coldness and valiance in their words. I'm teaching mecha, not deduction. Su Lu lowered his head slightly and said calmly, if you want me to do tactical deduction, even if you give me 3 divisions, in front of the Iron 7th Division, they will only end up dead. In a person's life, who knew how many conflicts they had to go through before they could reach their goal. However, the prerequisite for competing with others was that you had to have the ability to compete, except for some issues that involved principles and could not be challenged. The Iron 7th Division was not Macklin, and they were not the Empire's invaders. Su Lu knew that his tactical command was a blank piece of paper full of question marks, so at this time, he calmly and naturally retreated 90 kilometers away. Du Shaoqing, who was facing Su Lu from a distance, felt slightly silent and lonely. He did not think that Su Li's answer would be so simple and direct. Facing the hint of flirting that he deliberately released, she actually willingly admitted defeat. How could a person with such a soft waist be valued so highly by the marshal and that person? However, at this time, Su Lu raised his head and defended the officers. It's just that today was the first time the MX was used. The students have no experience, and the troops they commanded were not their own troops, so of course, they were not as strong as the Iron 7th Division. Although they failed, I feel that their performance was not bad. In the future, if they spend more time on the battlefield, they will not lose face for the Federation. As soon as these words were said, the officers, who had been in low spirits, could not help but straighten their chests. There was an additional trace of gratitude in their eyes as they looked forward. Looking at Su Lu, who was standing quietly in the group of instructors, Du Shaoqing's deep eyes flashed with a trace of gloominess. Because these words were originally intended for everyone to hear. The Federation and the upper echelons of the military had intended for him to carry out the final summary inspection work. Naturally, there was a deeper meaning to this. They were tacitly allowing and even encouraging him to establish his own authority in the military. In the previous lecture, Du Shaoqing had given these officer students a torrent of abuse, but in reality, he knew better than anyone else that these officer students had endless potential. He knew what kind of role they would play in the Federal Army system in the future battlefield. Harsh lectures and ridicule were not his goal. His goal was to subdue these arrogant fellows. In his vision, he would crush all of these officers' arrogance with a storm. Then, he would change the topic. When they were at their lowest, he would give them confidence and beat their hearts and mind. Like the spring breeze after a storm, he would capture their hearts and mind. Only then would he be able to leave the great name of Du Shaoqing in the hearts of the future young forces of the federal military. Seeing himself as the spring breeze, as the sun, Du Shaoqing's state of mind was very normal. He believed that he had the qualifications to become the unsetting sun of the federal military in the future. Now that he was a famous general of the Federation and the commander of the Iron 7th Division, he was already the target of admiration and worship in the eyes of the Federation officers. With a little beating, he would naturally be able to easily achieve his goal. However, after a series of tactical deductions, he suppressed the most famous Zhou Yu until his face turned slightly pale. The entire audience was silent. Just as Commander Du Shaoqing was about to change the topic and appease the crowd, someone extremely untimely and impudently disrupted the course he had planned. Then, there was another person who stole his lines. What made him even angrier was that the person who stole his lines just had to be that very unpleasant person, Su Lo. The clear sound of footsteps rang out in the quiet field. Pa pa pa. The sound of the hard military boots hitting the ground was crisp, but not loud. However, what was strange was that when all the officers, including Su Lu, looked at Commander Du, who was slowly walking over from the end of the line, they felt that his footsteps were exceptionally heavy and powerful. It was as if a heavy black mecha was walking out of a smoke-filled valley. Du Shaoqing walked to the center of the line and stared at Su Lu through his sunglasses. He didn't say anything for a long time. Su Lu took 2 steps forward and gave a military salute. He also didn't say anything. The smile on his face was completely gone. He calmly and solemnly narrowed his eyes. It was as if the sun was about to set and was burning his retinas. He felt a little uncomfortable. This kind of deathly silence and the feeling of almost confrontation made all the officers in the field feel a strong pressure. The trainees were very worried about this bastard, Instructor Xiao Su, but they didn't have the right to stand up and say anything. The instructors wanted to say a few words on behalf of Su Lu, but under this kind of pressure, no one dared to stand up. Even those undisciplined and strong members of Team 7 behind Su Lu were intimidated by the cold aura exuding from Du Shaoqing in this instant. A person's reputation was like the shadow of a tree. A cold general of the federal military, the youngest major general, just by standing at the front of the line, he was able to exude a boundless sense of pressure. After a long silence, Du Shaoqing finally opened his mouth to speak. The words that came out of his thin lips were cold and sharp. A lieutenant colonel and a mecha instructor. You admit that you don't know anything about tactical deduction, but you stand up for your students and challenge my judgment. Was it the Ministry of Defense or the Joint Chiefs of Staff who gave you this guts and this authority? The military camp was a simple and direct world. Even though Du Shaoqing was the youngest division commander in the Federation, the only major general, the most standard professional soldier, and the most idol-level figure, once he was enraged, he still walked the simple and direct path without so many twists and turns. His words were not as sharp as knives. They were like a bucket of ice water that had been splashed directly onto Su Li's head, sending a chill down his spine. Su Lu clasped his hands behind his back and lowered his head slightly. The dim light of dusk shone on his resolute and calm face. He didn't say anything to retort, keeping his head lowered so as not to meet Du Shaoqing's eyes, but he also didn't give off the feeling that he was surrendering. It was probably this attitude that caused Du Shaoqing's mood to darken. He glanced at the members of Team 7 behind Su Lu and said coldly, "You are no longer part of the 17th Division, you are just a bunch of trash. Don't embarrass the Marshal." Su Lu wasn't moved by these words, because he wasn't part of the 17th Division to begin with. However, the faces of those fellows behind him were filled with anger. Du Shaoqing, however, didn't look at them anymore. He turned his head to stare at Su Lu and scolded him coldly, "Trash is trash. You are also trash." Hearing the word trash, Su Lu vaguely caught on to something. Other than Park Ji-ho, who had died at Hushan Road, and the 2 Iron 7th Division officers who had been heavily injured by him and couldn't participate in the graduation parade. Du Shaoqing's intention to humiliate him probably had something to do with this. But was this because of his pride as an ace officer of the Federation, or did it have something to do with that old man in Philadelphia? I don't know why the Ministry of National Defense would take in a criminal, Du Shaoqing said darkly, but you actually used the name of an instructor to heavily injure 2 officers of my division during training. Do you really think that the military court won't dare to do anything to you? That I won't dare to do anything to you? Du Shaoqing's voice wasn't loud, but every word was like the sound of a cannon as it blasted into Su Li's ears. Su Lu didn't want to go against this strong military man, but when he heard these words, his eyebrows that had already fluttered once raised again. The interaction between people was a very strange thing. If you didn't like someone at first sight, you would not like them for the rest of your life. This was probably the reason why the tiger of the Zhong family in the West Woods kept suppressing Du Shaoqing. And Su Lu also had the same feeling when he saw Du Shaoqing. The coldness of this major general made him very uncomfortable. If a general scolded a lieutenant colonel, in any other situation, anyone could only silently accept it, let alone the person who scolded him was Du Shaoqing of the Iron 7th Division. But Su Lu was just an ordinary lieutenant colonel. Du Shaoqing's cold and oppressive aura could make everyone quiet, but it couldn't really press his head down. It should be known that in the room of the military prison in Qinqing, even the lightning-like gaze of the military god of Philadelphia couldn't break his big heart, let alone other people. So he raised his head, and his slightly squinted eyes were unusually bright against the beautiful sunset in the west. He answered, "Reporting to Commander Du, I didn't use the name of an instructor to suppress your subordinates so that they wouldn't dare to fight back, so I took the opportunity to heavily injure them. The investigation report of the base is already out, you can read it yourself." After a slight pause, Su Lu turned his head and looked directly at the sunglasses on Du Shaoqing's nose bridge. He said loudly, "Those two officers once passed on the teachings of the instructor that a person's strength is the combination of speed and strength. And those two officers also said at the scene of the challenge that the 7th Division often suffered heavy injuries in close combat training, and asked me not to worry about it. So, they were heavily injured. This is the result of the fight. If the commander doubts the investigation report of the base, you can let the close combat experts of the 7th Division, or you can try it yourself." The calm and loud voice echoed in the field. Everyone's expression was very interesting, especially the members of the 7th Division and the training officers. Instructor Su's words couldn't be said to be heroic, nor could they be said to be powerful. However, when he said it in such a normal way, the expressions of Du Shaoqing and the other officers of the Iron 7th Division slightly froze at the same time. They had probably never seen a lieutenant colonel who dared to speak to Du Shaoqing like that. "Very good, at least you have some gut." Half of Du Shaoqing's face was gloomy. He raised his right hand that was holding a black leather glove and pointed it at Su Li's face. He said, "Violating military regulations and talking back to your superiors. How can a free and lazy person like you be qualified to be a soldier of the Federation? The military camp is not a world for people like you. Leave as soon as possible. Otherwise, if one day you violate the regulations on the battlefield, I will personally destroy you." At this time, Instructor Du's voice was extremely low. Probably only the two people involved could hear it, but Su Lu could feel a real sense of danger and coldness in this voice. He knew that Du Shaoqing was speaking the truth. Although he had never found the real reason, he believed that if in the future on the battlefield of the universe, the other party would not hesitate to destroy him if he found some excuse. This feeling of extreme danger made the hair on Su Li's neck stand on end. Just like in the underground parking lot of the Linhai State Gymnasium, just like in the foundation building surrounded by mountains in the 4 states, when he encountered fatal danger, his often smiling eyes would grow brighter and brighter. It was like seeing the first ray of starlight after breaking through the gray clouds of the Donglin region. What could he do when he was coldly reprimanded and threatened by a major general who held military power? There seemed to be only a difference of 2 ranks between a major general and a lieutenant colonel, but there was a deep and almost insurmountable gap between a general and a field officer. Many ambitious professional soldiers eventually fell in front of this abyss. Faced with Du Shaoqing's indifferent ridicule and humiliation, Su Lu seemed to have no choice but to listen. However, his eyes grew brighter and brighter. How could he return to calmness? It was at this moment that he thought of Little Watermelon's father, the West Woods tiger who had suppressed Du Shaoqing for an entire 10 years. When faced with Du Shaoqing and his 7th Division, there was no other way but to be unreasonable, to be incomparably overbearing and violent. Su Li's narrowed eyes were almost as bright as the new moon in the sky. He stared at the black leather glove waving indifferently in front of his nose and suddenly said, "Lambskin?" The black leather glove in Du Shaoqing's hand slowly came to a stop in the evening wind. Bureau HTD doesn't care? The Federation's laws are always a little higher than the military regulations. A hint of a sincere smile appeared on Su Li's face. Violating the regulations, contradicting the superiors, being free and undisciplined, does that mean you don't have the qualifications to be a soldier of the Federation? Then how can someone who brazenly uses lambskin as a glove and violates the Federation's Wildlife Protection Act be qualified to be a teacher? Du Shaoqing looked coldly at Su Lu. His expression was as cold as ever, but there seemed to be a hint of mockery at the corner of his mouth. Who in the Federation didn't know that Commander Du of the Iron 7th Division was the role model of a soldier, the standard role model? His style of attire was unparalleled, and his sunglasses and black leather gloves were his style of dress. As a major general, who would dare to question such privilege? Hearing Su Li's words, Du Shaoqing was slightly angered. He said indifferently, "You can ask Bureau HDD to come find me, as long as they dare to interfere with my business." These words were very imposing and arrogant. The Iron 7th Division had always been an imposing, arrogant, and protective force. Their commander was even more so. Su Li's question was clearly asking for humiliation. Du Shaoqing's indifferent words revealed a hint of disdain and mockery that couldn't be hidden. About injuring an officer of the Iron 7th Division, contradicting the superiors, and violating the regulations. Su Lu looked at Du Shaoqing's sunglasses and said calmly, "You can ask the legal department, no, the Ministry of Defense to come find me, as long as they dare to interfere with my business." Whatever Du Shaoqing said, Su Lu said the same thing. Normal Federation laws couldn't control the commander of the Iron 7th Division, but could the military regulations control Su Lu? This was a resounding slap to Du Shaoqing's face. "You have privileges, but I have a father-in-law who is the scapegoat, and a distant relative beside Feiqing Lake. As the saying goes, unreasonable and unreasonable, in the end, isn't this what it means to be angry?" Du Shaoqing's face finally changed. The cedar tree on the mountain began to loosen. Snow rustled and fell, and endless coldness rose. However, just as this major general was about to flip out, Su Lu said something that directly slapped him in the face, and also didn't allow him to apply the ointment. He looked straight ahead, his line of sight passing through Du Shaoqing's ice-like shoulders and side face to look at the last trace of sunset in the distance. He lowered his voice and said, "Don't go crazy anymore. Otherwise, if you really force me to go crazy, what good will it do you? You are a big shot. If you are beaten by me in front of so many people, how humiliating will it be for you? How can you be the second army god of the Federation in the future? I believe you know that I can fight very well. Your bodyguards didn't have time to shoot. The point is, you are standing too close to me." Su Lu withdrew his gaze and looked at Du Shaoqing. He said softly, "If I beat you until you are disabled, at most I will not be a soldier and be sent to Qingqing to be locked up for a dozen years. I don't care, and you should have investigated me. I can still be pardoned for killing Macklin. I didn't want to be a lieutenant colonel. It was that person in the official residence, and that old man who asked me to be a lieutenant colonel." Su Lu lowered his voice and finished this long paragraph, which was rare for him. Then he took a deep breath and said with narrowed eyes, reporting to Commander, "Please allow me to not flip out." No one present heard what Su Lu said. They only noticed that Commander Du Shaoqing had retracted his hands behind his back and clenched them tightly. The black lambskin glove on his left hand was clenched so tightly that it was somewhat deformed. Du Shaoqing stared at Su Li's face and was silent for a long time. When the anger in his heart gradually turned into a kind of cold emotion, he smiled slightly and said, "Good, very good. You are indeed the second person who dares to threaten me to my face after that savage in the West Woods." Everyone was silent. Night fell, and everyone was shocked and confused. Commander Du Shaoqing of the Iron 7th Division had never smiled in his entire life in the military camp, but today he smiled. What was his current state of mind? Chapter 336. Power, glory, and wealth were all things that Su Lu liked, but he didn't feel that they were indispensable. Some of the things that he truly cared about had already been blown away by the wind in front of the Parliament building, while the other parts were firmly reborn in a certain building or a dark prison cell. Those things that he cared about the most were not things that could be forcibly taken away by external forces. Thus, for the current him, he had nothing to lose, so he naturally had nothing to fear. His eyes narrowed, and the strict social order and certain unbreakable rules of the military camp were crushed by his eyelids. Back in the day, the Fei Qing brute had once caused the Empire's emperor to bleed and fall in a fit of anger. The Federation's ancient proverb had a similar saying. Du Shaoqing wasn't the Empire's emperor, and Su Lu wasn't Li Pifu, but Su Lu truly did have a bit of the swift and fierce aura beneath his cheerfulness, as well as the ability to launch an explosive strike. This displayed a deterrent force. Teacher Du's status was dignified, cold, and tyrannical. He had great ambitions and great aspirations, so he naturally couldn't fight with an unreasonable barefoot man like Su Lu. This was a natural imbalance and weakness. Su Lu had helped the Federation choke a poisonous seed of the Empire to death. However, after the incident, many of the Federation's top politicians, as well as the upper echelons of the 7 great families, developed a strong sense of vigilance toward him. They even wanted to erase his existence, precisely because of this reason. For a stable society, someone like Su Lu who had the strength to challenge a certain order, and dared to do so, was not a good thing. The stable structure that human society relied on was the order and arrangement of social strata. Someone who threatened this order absolutely could not be allowed. Even that old man from Fei Qing, if he wasn't a military god who had established outstanding military service for the Federation, if he wasn't surrounded by truly vicious Empire invaders at the other end of the universe, it was likely that the Federation would have long acted like a living creature, trying to expel the mutated cells in its body. Lady Tai knew that Su Li's threat to the Federation didn't only lie in his intentions and ability, but also in a deeper layer of relationship. Thus, her desire to erase Su Lu was stronger than anyone else's. However, as of now, Su Lu was still alive and well. Du Shaoqing smiled for the first time in the military camp. His smile was filled with faint self-mockery, because he was very clear that Su Li's threat was indeed something that he was very afraid of. Facing an expert who did not care about rules, using military rules to pressure him was simply impossible. Since that was the case, how could he fly into a rage? But in the end, Du Shaoqing was still Du Shaoqing, a famous general with a slight self-deprecating smile. He was more frightening than ever before, but he was able to forcibly suppress the madly growing anger in his heart and did not lose his composure at all. He just stared at Su Lu in front of him and then slowly took off his sunglasses. Deep in his eye sockets, his gaze was deep and cold, like a deep mining pit on some mineral planet. Methane and snow were accumulated there, reflecting the bright background of the universe, giving people a feeling that they couldn't bear the coldness. "I heard that you were the one who successfully developed the MX?" Du Shaoqing stared into Su Li's eyes and said. As a famous general of a generation, being able to judge the situation and be brave enough to make a decisive decision was a form of true military wisdom. In just a few seconds, he had calmed down and accepted Su Li's threat that neither side would fly into a rage. The officers present all knew of Su Li's important role in the development of the MX mecha, so they didn't show any shock at these words. Su Lu let out a small sigh of relief. Just as he was about to explain something, he heard Du Shaoqing continue calmly. In the first test battle of the MX Mecha on Ka Chifeng, you completely defeated Lieutenant Colonel Li Feng. I think that your understanding of the MX Mecha should be number 1 in the Federation. Under the influence of President Sieg and Lady Tai, the details of the MX Mecha battle at the Old Moon Base had always been kept a secret. The Federation's military only knew that in that battle, the Nutshell Engineering Department had won against the Federation's Academy of Sciences, and the MX Mecha had been finalized. However, they never knew who those 2 extremely powerful mecha pilots were. In the training base, Zhou Yu had known the truth, and the members of Team 7 had also vaguely understood some of it from Secretary Bai's mouth. However, most people did not know this. Right now, hearing Instructor Du say it calmly, they finally understood that their mecha instructor was actually someone who could defeat the successor of the Lees of Philadelphia, that crazy genius. The lined-up officers stared at Instructor Little Su in shock, somewhat unable to believe their own ears. Thinking back to how they had been trying to use mecha to challenge their instructor these past few months, they couldn't help but feel a sense of shame and fear. Su Lu knew why Du Shaoqing would bring up his most outstanding achievement at this time. He looked at the other, frowned slightly, and said, reporting to Instructor, "This is a Federation secret. 3 days ago, the details of the battle at Ka Chifeng have already been declassified." Du Shaoqing looked at him expressionlessly. A strange feeling grew in Su Li's heart. He wasn't sure what the cold and callous instructor in front of him meant by saying all this. Right then, Du Shaoqing continued coldly, "I heard that you were personally recruited into the army by the Lord Marshal?" In the past few decades, the Federation had only had 2 marshals. One was the current president, but no one would directly address him as the Grand Marshal. The other was the actual marshal. Although that old man had already resigned from all his military positions many years ago, returning to the shores of Lake Philadelphia to watch the water, the mountains, the snow, the fish, and the world, everyone in the Federation, especially the soldiers, would respectfully refer to this old man as the Marshal whenever they mentioned him. Du Shaoqing's words shocked the officers present even more than the 2 facts he had revealed earlier. Su Lu looked at this person's deep gaze in slight surprise, but he could already hear the sounds of discussion coming from behind him. To be personally chosen by the great war god and specially recruited into the army, this was more glorious than any other kind of glory. The officers looked at Instructor Su with shock and curiosity. Even the excellent military posture they had been maintaining all this time was somewhat scattered. Du Shaoqing looked at Su Lu expressionlessly. He was forced by this seemingly ordinary man to the point that he couldn't flip out. The anger in his chest turned into a stifled knife, almost cutting his heart and lungs. He directly admitted that the other party had the qualifications to make him unable to flip out, and then announced to the crowd. Then, the teacher changed the topic and returned to the topic at the beginning. You previously thought that the students didn't use the MX machine, and you are undoubtedly the most experienced soldier. Du Shaoqing said lightly, "Marshal Li admires you a lot. If you say that you don't know how to make tactical deductions, who would believe that? If you were the one attacking today, how would you attack?" The words were as cold as ice, but no one could stop them. Du Shaoqing's strategy was amazing, and no one could compare to his detailed deductions. He had actually used the commanding techniques on the battlefield at this moment. "If I can't use military rank to suppress you, I'll use logic to suppress you." In just 3 sentences, Du Shaoqing had pushed Su Lu to the front of everyone's burning gazes, pushing him to a certain height. "You are the developer of the MX Mecha, you are the strong person who defeated Madman Li, you are the person personally groomed by the Great Marshal." If Su Lu still said that he didn't know how to respond at this time, who would believe him? With Su Li's personality, if he didn't know how to respond, he wouldn't. He wasn't particularly afraid of losing face, but at this time, Du Shaoqing had connected him to the Lees of Philadelphia, so he couldn't help but be cautious. The reason he could survive and leave the dark military prison was all because of that old man. Although he viewed that old man as a distant relative in his heart, he knew very well that the upper echelons of the federal military all saw him as someone the great war god would focus on grooming. Otherwise, why would Deputy Commander E be so cordial with a small fry like him during the ceremony this morning? It had nothing to do with protecting the glory of the Lees of Philadelphia. Su Lu just didn't want that old man's vision to be questioned by Du Shaoqing. He also didn't want to become a silent rock after throwing a tantrum, so he wanted to answer Du Shaoqing's question about the military drill. The heavens pitied him. Su Lu was really a rookie when it came to military tactics. Even if Du Shaoqing wasn't personally in command today, how many generals in the Federation dared to say that they could break through the joint defense of the Iron 7th Division? How could he break through? After a moment of silence, Su Lu raised his head to look at Du Shaoqing and said, "I don't know how to make tactical deductions, so I will let Zhou Yu continue to be in full command, just like how the situation developed during the day. Then, use your method to gamble with your life and bet where your division headquarters is." In the beginning, he had not been confident enough in his words, but after a few sentences, he remembered that he was just messing around anyway. He straightened himself up and said, "The M-Series mechas of the Special Mecha Battalion are all stationed in the command center. I won't bring them with me. As long as Zhou Yu can bet where the headquarters of the 7th Division is, give me 8 MX Series, and I will break through your headquarters. Give me 8 MX Series, and I will break through your headquarters." How bold and arrogant were these words! It even made people feel that they were ridiculous. The MX Mecha's performance was indeed excellent, and its surprise attack power was extremely strong. However, when facing an entire division of mechanics, how could it be possible to break through the layers of defense and attack the other's headquarters? Strangely enough, when the officers heard Su Lu say this, they didn't show any mocking expressions, but instead fell into deep thought. Just like how Du Shaoqing had been able to stand up straight and give off the feeling of a cedar tree pressing down on their heads, making them not dare to speak, a person's reputation was like the shadow of a tree. To be able to operate a MX Mecha to defeat Madman Li, to be able to gain the favor of the Federation's God of War, no matter how outrageous the mecha surprise attack Su Lu said was, they couldn't help but ponder it. Su Lu knew that he was indeed speaking nonsense. He didn't know how to make tactical deductions, so he didn't have the ability to make any of his own judgments when it came to commanding. His only source of confidence in the military camp came from the swift and agile attack style of the MX Mecha. To break through the combined defense of the Iron 7th Division, he had no way at all, so he could only let Zhou Yu continue to be in command, and then repeat Du Shaoqing's murderous command judgment, and then make a strange move, saying that he would use 8 MX Series to break through the enemy's headquarters. In any case, it was all said with his mouth, so there was no way to prove that he was lying. Su Lu thought in his heart. At this moment, the spirit of Mr. Shi the Rogue, little brother Wei the Jianghu Wei, the former rogue orphan, possessed him. "Very good, very funny." Du Shaoqing looked at Su Lu and said coldly, "Who in this world can do it?" "Marshal Li did it before," Su Lu replied after a moment of silence, but in his heart, he was thinking that the uncle should also have this ability. Back then, Li Pifu had controlled the M37 mecha to launch a surprise attack thousands of li away and kill the Emperor of the Empire. Compared to controlling the new MX mecha to break through a division and destroy a division, it was undoubtedly many times more difficult. A glimmer of light appeared in Du Shaoqing's deep eyes. He had originally been prepared to say that the marshal was already old, but when the words reached his mouth, they became the following sentence. Still, having the Marshal on the battlefield is in itself the greatest humiliation of our Federation soldiers. Who else but the Marshal can come up with such a ridiculous tactical design like yours? Do you really think you can? Sulu lowered his head slightly and was silent for a long time. Suddenly, he thought of the brilliance that spread throughout the universe and said softly, "Maybe I can." The field was silent, awkward silence. The officers woke up from the shock of Su Li's 3 brilliant battle achievements. After some thought, they confirmed that Instructor Su's tactical deduction could not be said to be daring. It was pure nonsense. Even if he was given 80 mecha, he still might not be able to get close to the Iron 7th Division's division headquarters. However, at this time, when they heard that Sulu actually really thought that he could, they could not help but feel awkward. In the gradually darkening night and in the strange atmosphere, Instructor Du Shaoqing laughed once again. His slightly mocking smile contained undisguised coldness and disgust. As a representative of the academic faction of the federal military, he had always believed that on the battlefield, strategy and tactics were the key to determining victory and defeat. An individual's bravery would always be the bravery of an ordinary person, unable to determine the overall situation. It was precisely because of this unbreakable belief that Du Shaoqing was somewhat dismissive of Su Lu and the new MX mecha that the federal military valued so much. Today's graduation demonstration seemed to have proven his belief. However, at this time, Sulu actually dared to say that he could defeat the Iron 7th Division's division headquarters with just 8 MX mecha. What kind of ridiculous and irresponsible nonsense was this? Did he need to use ironclad facts to educate this shameless person in front of him? Du Shaoqing stared coldly at Sulu. Most of the participating troops had already left, and Iron 7th Division was only left with a full battalion. However, he believed that even a well-trained full battalion would be enough to trap and kill 8 MX mecha. Looks like you're really stupid when it comes to tactical deduction. Du Shaoqing took a deep breath and thought about the instructions of that big shot in the capital before he left. He decided to let Sulu off the hook for now. After saying this, he turned around and left, still as cold as ever. On the other hand, a few of the officers of the 3rd Military Region looked at Sulu with disdain, as if they were looking at the biggest idiot in the world. Sulu didn't angrily call for the other to come back and compete with him. Instead, he was somewhat glad that Iron 7th Division didn't allow him to hold another military drill to see if his tactical deduction could succeed. His military boots were already soaked. Relying on 8 MX mecha to fight an entire battalion of mechanics, that was really an idiot. Even if the Special Forces mixed 8 MX mecha, they still wouldn't be able to defeat a division headquarters. You really dare to talk nonsense. To everyone's surprise, from the side of the rostrum, a group of black officers walked over. Surrounded by those generals, they were the Defense Minister Zhou Yingxing and the 1st Military Region's commanding officer, General Miles. Du Shaoqing, who was just about to leave, paused and stopped in his tracks. Under the shocked and confused gazes of the crowd, General Miles smiled and said, "Shaoqing, didn't the 7th Division still leave a battalion behind? Let this guy try to defeat a battalion." You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.